You have seen it 1,000 times. A man on horseback, alone, the Texas sunset burning orange behind him. The brim of his hat cuts a clean line against the sky. He rides like the land belongs to him, like nothing in the world has a claim on where he goes or how long he takes to get there. Nah, boss. No schedule. No one waiting on the other end. You know this man. He was in every Western your father watched. He looked out from the covers of paperback novels in drugstore racks. He became, somewhere along the way, one of the things America decided it was. Now set that image aside. The man in this story woke before 4 in the morning. He pulled on boots that were cold and damp from the night before. He drank his coffee, standing up, because there was no time to sit. He spent the next 12 hours eating the dust kicked up by 2,500 longhorn cattle moving north through Texas in the summer of 1872. And he did it for $30 a month. His name was Eli. He was 18 years old in the spring of 1872, living in Bexar County in South Texas. His father had been enslaved on a cattle ranch until 1865 and had kept working that same ranch afterward, because the work was what he knew, and there was nowhere else that made sense to go. Eli grew up on horseback. He learned to read a herd of cattle before he learned to read a page, watching the ears and the shoulders and the way 2,000 pounds of animal communicated through small shifts in weight and direction. He was good at it, and in Bexar County in 1872, being good with cattle and horses was one of the few things a young black man could be good at that translated directly into wages. The wages were $30 a month. He found the hiring notice on a Thursday morning in April, tacked to a post outside a feed store. Drive leaving in 2 weeks. Heading north along the Chisholm Trail to the railroad at Abilene, Kansas. Experienced cowhands needed. $30 a month, board and meals included. Approximately 3 months. Eli read it twice. He was not thinking about freedom. He was not thinking about open skies or the romance of the trail. He was thinking about a bay horse stabled at the ranch where he and his father had both worked. A horse his father had ridden for 12 years, before the ranch owner bought the animal outright after his father died. The owner had offered to sell the horse back to Eli for $70. He would hold the price until the end of the year. Eli had $50 saved. 3 months on a cattle drive would give him $90 before expenses. The math was simple. The trail was the shortest distance between where he was and what he wanted. He pulled out his knife and scratched his name into the wood below the notice. That was how it started. A name on a post, a number in his head, a horse in a stable that belonged, for now, to someone else. The legend of the American cowboy was built on moments like that one. It just left out the math. It left out the wet boots and the $30 and the bay horse and the owner who had set a price and a deadline. It turned the man riding toward the sunset into a symbol of freedom and forgot to mention that he was riding toward a specific destination for a specific reason with a specific number in his head. The number was $70. The sunset was just the direction he happened to be facing. This is the story of what the ride actually looked like. Eli knew the economics before he ever signed his name. He had grown up in them. He had watched the ranchers around Bexar County do their calculations, had listened to the men talk at the feed store about prices in Chicago and what it cost to move a steer from South Texas to a railhead in Kansas. He understood the math, the way you understand things you have been living inside your whole life, not as a lesson but as the texture of how the world worked. Texas, in 1865, had a problem that looked, from a certain angle, like an opportunity. The war was over, and the South had lost. Confederate money was worthless. The plantation economy had collapsed. The men who had run the large ranching operations came home to find their finances in ruins. But the cattle were still there. Longhorns had been roaming the Texas grasslands for generations. Descended from Spanish cattle, brought over by early settlers, and left to breed freely across the open range. During the war, with not enough men to manage them, they had multiplied without interference. By 1865, millions of longhorns moved across the Texas plains, nearly ownerless, each one worth $3 or $4 in Texas. In Chicago, that same animal was worth $30 to $40. The gap between those two numbers was the entire reason the cattle drives existed. A rancher who could move his herd from Texas to a Kansas railhead, load them onto trains headed east, and sell them into the Chicago market would multiply his money 10 times over. The math was that clean. The problem was physical. 1,000 miles of open country between the cattle and the market, and no practical way to close that gap except to walk the animals north and keep them alive along the way. Eli had watched ranchers hire drivers every spring since he was a boy. He had watched the drives leave South Texas heading north, the dust rising behind them until they were gone over the horizon. He had never been part of one. He understood what he was signing up for. The route was the Chisholm Trail, running from deep South Texas up through Indian Territory and into Kansas, ending at the railroad town of Abilene. Other trails ran parallel or diverged to reach different railheads, but Chisholm was the main artery, worn into the ground by years of drives before his. The chain worked like this: Texas ranch to cattle trail, to Indian Territory to Kansas, railhead to Chicago, stockyards to eastern cities to American dinner tables. At every point in that chain, somebody made money. The ranchers who owned the herds, the buyers at the railhead, the railroads, the Chicago meat packers, the restaurants and butchers at the far end. The men who walked the cattle from Texas to Kansas made $30 a month. Eli had done this arithmetic more than once. He knew exactly where he sat in the chain. He had no illusions about it. But $30 a month was more than he could make doing anything else available to him in Bexar County that spring. And the bay horse cost $70. And the owner had given him until the end of the year. 2 weeks after he scratched his name into that post, he rode to the assembly point south of San Antonio, with his gear rolled behind his saddle and the $50 stitched into the lining of his coat where it would not shift or rattle. He did not know yet what 3 months on the trail would cost him in other ways. He knew the number he needed and the job that would get him there. For now, that was enough. The crew assembled on a Monday morning in the second week of May, outside a ranch south of San Antonio, where the herd had been gathered over the previous 3 weeks. 12 men, standing or sitting near their horses in the early light, sizing each other up the way people do when they are about to spend 3 months in close quarters and are still deciding what they think about that. Eli arrived before most of them. He tied his horse to the fence rail and stood where he could watch the others come in. What he saw did not match the illustrations he had seen in newspapers. There was no single type, no unified version of the man the word cowhand was supposed to call to mind. What assembled itself in the gray morning light was a collection of individuals brought together by economics and geography, and the fact that they had all been available and willing to sign a piece of paper in the same window of time. Miguel was a vaquero in his mid-40s, from below the Rio Grande, who had been working cattle since before Eli was born. He wore his rope on the left side of his saddle in the old Spanish style and moved around horses with a quietness that came not from training but from so many years of small daily adjustments that the animal and the man had stopped, surprising each other. There were two Anglo brothers from the hill country, loud in the way of young men who are not yet sure of themselves, and cover it with volume. They were 19 and 22, and had done one drive before, which they mentioned several times in the first hour. There was a man named Ambrose, black like Eli, perhaps 30 years old, who arrived last, said nothing, tied his horse with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and leaned against the fence with his arms folded and his hat pulled low. A wiry man from Arkansas who chewed tobacco constantly, a quiet Mexican cowhand named Tomas, who would turn out to be one of the finest horsemen on the drive. Two Anglo riders in their 30s who seemed to know each other from some previous job and communicated in half sentences and nods. Three black cowhands, counting Eli, three with Mexican heritage, 6 Anglo, the actual makeup of a Texas cattle crew in 1872, which looked nothing like the mythology that would later be built around it. The vaquero tradition was older than Texas itself. The techniques that Anglo ranchers called cowboying, the roping, the herding, the reading of cattle that every man on this crew depended on for his survival, had been developed over generations by Mexican and Spanish riders working the ranges of northern Mexico and South Texas long before the first Anglo settler arrived. The words themselves carried the history if you listened. Lasso from lazo, rodeo from rodear, meaning to surround, mustang from mesteno, chaps from chaparreras. The vocabulary of the American cowboy was built on a Spanish foundation that most people had stopped noticing. The way you stop noticing the foundation of a house once the walls are up. One man on the crew had not stopped noticing. Casimiro was 55 years old, a vaquero hired as senior hand, whose last name Eli never learned because no one used it. He was short and lean, and wore a battered hat that had been repaired in at least 3 places. He had eyes that registered everything, and a face that gave back almost nothing. That first morning, Eli watched Casimiro assess the Remuda, the spare string of horses that would travel with the drive. He walked the line slowly, not touching any of them, just looking, pausing at some longer than others, reading something that Eli could not yet read. Then there was Wallace, cook, 51 years old. He had fought for the Union at Chickamauga and taken a piece of Confederate iron in his right leg that had never fully come out, leaving him with a walk that tilted slightly to one side. He had been cooking on cattle drives for 6 years. The chuck wagon he tended was more organized than most homes Eli had been inside, and Wallace moved through it with the authority of a man who understood that his domain was the difference between a crew that held together and one that did not. And then there was Denton, trail boss, 43 years old, 9 drives before this one. He had the kind of face that accumulates information without expressing much of it. And he spoke in the economy of words that Eli would come to understand was not curtness, but precision. On a cattle drive, the words that mattered were the ones that told you what to do. Those words needed to be clear and fast, and not buried in anything extra. Denton walked the line of assembled men that first morning, without greeting them. He looked at each man the way Casimiro had looked at the horses. Then he stopped at the end of the line, turned, and spoke. "You know what you signed up for," he said. 3 months. Abilene, or close to it. I make the calls. You follow them without a debate in the middle of the work. Questions come before or after. Not during. He paused. If you have a problem with how I run this drive, you tell me at camp. If you have a problem with another man, you tell me. Not him. I have buried 2 men on previous drives. Both died doing something they should not have been doing, or doing it wrong. I will not bury anyone on this one if I can help it. You can help me by paying attention. That was the whole speech. Eli looked at Denton and thought, this is the man I will be watching for the next 3 months. Not because Denton would explain things to him, because Denton would not. And the things he did not explain would be visible in what he did instead. His father had taught him this without sitting down to teach it formally. You learned more from watching what people did when they thought no one was looking than from anything they said when they knew you were there. Denton walked to his horse and mounted. We move in an hour, he said. They moved in an hour. The authority of a trail boss in 1872 had no real parallel in ordinary American life. He was not like a foreman on a construction job, who had a company office somewhere setting the terms of his decisions. He was not like a ship's captain, who at least had charts drawn by other people and ports where he could resupply and ask questions. On the trail, between the moment the herd left the home ranch and the moment it reached Abilene, Denton was the final word on everything. Which river crossing to use? How many miles to push in a day? Whether to camp near a waterhole that looked questionable, or push 5 more miles to a better one? How to handle a cowhand who had been drinking at the last town? Whether to pay the toll asked by a tribal authority for the right to cross their land? No vote, no discussion, no appeal. This concentration of power existed not because anyone had designed it on principle, but because the alternative was worse. A herd of 2,500 longhorns could be moving steadily one moment and running blind the next. When that happened, the difference between a disaster and a manageable setback was a single decision made in the right direction in the first 30 seconds. There was no time to discuss it. Denton understood this, the way you understand things you have learned, by being wrong about them, when the cost of being wrong was real. He had been wrong at a river crossing on his 3rd drive, pushing the herd through at a point that looked passable but was not. He lost 40 cattle and nearly lost a man. He had been wrong on his 5th drive about water between 2 established stops, and the cattle arrived at the next source weaker than they should have been, and weaker cattle sold for less. And the difference came out of the season's accounting in a way Denton remembered longer than the man who owned the herd. By 1872, On his 10th drive, his decision-making had become something that looked like instinct but was accumulated experience running faster than conscious thought. He looked at a river and saw not just the water, but the specific combination of current and bank angle and cattle behavior that his previous crossings had taught him to read. He looked at the afternoon sky in a particular way and knew, with probability, if not certainty, what the night would bring. He did not explain any of this. He was not secretive. He simply did not have the habit of narrating his reasoning. And the drives had taught him that men who spent a lot of time explaining themselves usually did so because they were less certain than they wanted to appear. Eli learned this about Denton in the first week. On the third day of the drive, Denton diverted the herd a mile east of the intended route without explanation. The crew adjusted and kept moving. That evening, Wallace mentioned it near the chuck wagon while filling the water barrel. Eli asked what he thought the reason was. Wallace did not look up from what he was doing. "Salt Lake," he said, "quarter-mile off the direct route. Cattle would have smelled it and broken for it. Would have cost 2 hours to collect them." Eli held his coffee cup and thought about that. Denton had known the salt lick was there. He had known the cattle would go for it. He had moved an entire day's route a mile east to avoid a problem that no one else on the crew had seen coming. And he had done it without saying a word, because saying a word was not the most efficient way to solve that particular problem. Moving the herd was. On the 5th evening, Denton rode north alone for about 20 minutes and came back without explaining where he had gone. He said one thing to Wallace before turning in take on extra water in the morning. "Fill the auxiliary barrels." Wallace said yes without asking why. Eli watched this exchange from across the camp. He filed it away with the salt lick. Denton had seen something on that solo ride, or calculated something, that had led him to a specific instruction about water. The instruction was real and concrete. The reasoning behind it had not been shared. This was how the man operated. On the 9th night of the drive, Eli was helping Wallace rinse out the coffee pot when something went wrong. It happened fast. A sound from the far edge of the herd. Low and wrong. Not the usual settling noise of cattle bedding down. Then the shape of an animal separating from the dark mass of the herd, moving away from the group with the particular deliberateness of a longhorn that had made a decision. Eli was moving before he had fully processed what he was seeing. He took the closest horse. Not June. Not one of his own string. Just the nearest animal at the picket line, and went after the steer at a canter, trying to remember everything he had observed from the flank position over the past week. Cut off the direction of travel. Come at the animal from an angle, not straight behind. Give it away back to the herd that feels like its own choice. He got the angle wrong. The steer saw him coming and accelerated. And for about 2 minutes, Eli was chasing a 1,200-pound longhorn through the dark Kansas grass. Neither of them in control of the situation. Then Casimiro appeared. He came from the left at a wide, unhurried arc, positioning himself not between the steer and the open country, but between the steer and the direction it had decided was safety. The steer slowed, uncertain. Casimiro held his position. The steer turned back toward the herd. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Casimiro rode past Eli without stopping. He did not say anything. He went back to the far edge of the herd and resumed his position like nothing had happened. Eli walked his borrowed horse back to the picket line and stood there for a moment in the dark. He had gotten it wrong. He knew exactly how he had gotten it wrong. He had come in too tight, too fast, given the animal no room to make the choice he needed it to make. Casimiro had solved the problem by giving the steer an option rather than a wall. He put the horse back on the picket line and went to find June. He checked her legs, her feet, the way she held her weight. She was fine. He stood with his hand on her neck in the dark and thought about the angle Casimiro had taken. The wide, lazy arc that had looked almost casual and had been anything but. Tomorrow he would try it differently. That was all there was to do. Wallace woke at 3:30 in the morning, not because someone woke him, because 3:30 was when the work required him to wake. And his body had learned this, the way bodies learn things that are required of them long enough and consistently enough that the learning moves below the level of decision. By the time the first gray suggestion of light appeared at the eastern edge of the sky, the fire was going and the coffee was on. The chuck wagon sat at the edge of camp with its back end open. The hinged lid of the chuck box folded down to form a work surface at Wallace's waist height. Inside the box, every drawer and compartment held a specific thing in a specific place. Salt in the upper left, baking powder beside it, the good knife on the hook inside the right panel, coffee in the large tin at the bottom. Always enough of it. Always. Wallace made biscuits by feel. He had made them so many times that the measurements lived in his hands rather than his head. The right amounts of flour and lard and salt combining in the Dutch oven in proportions that came out correct, not because he measured them, but because his hands knew what correct felt like. The biscuits went into the coals before the crew was fully awake. By the time the men were up and moving, the smell of them was already in the air, mixing with the coffee, smoke, and the morning cold. That smell was doing something important that had nothing to do with nutrition. It was telling 12 tired men that the day had a beginning. Charles Goodnight had built the first chuck wagon in 1866, taking a surplus army wagon and rebuilding the back end into a traveling kitchen. The chuck box fitted to the rear gate, the wagon bed carrying heavy supplies. Other outfits had modified the design since then, but the principle was the same everywhere. A mobile base that moved ahead of the herd each day to have camp set up and food ready when the drive arrived. The cook drove the wagon. He was not a cowhand. He did not ride behind the herd. His job was to get ahead of it, which meant he was often alone for hours at a stretch, moving across country in the quiet before the cattle arrived to change it. He saw the land as it was before the drive came through. Then he saw the crew come in at the end of each day. And the double perspective gave him information no one else on the drive had in quite the same form. He knew when the drive had been hard before anyone said a word about it. There was a specific quality to the silence of a crew that had pushed through bad weather or difficult terrain, different from the ordinary silence of men who were simply tired. There was a way the shoulders sat, a way the eyes moved or did not move, that told him what the afternoon had cost. On those evenings, Wallace used what he had. The food was still beans and bacon and biscuits, because that was what there was. But how it was prepared, how it was served, the temperature it arrived at, whether there was a little more pepper in the beans or a slightly larger portion of salt pork. Those things were within his control. He used that control deliberately. He never talked about this. It was just the work. The way, all of it, was just the work. One decision after another, in the dark, at 3:30 in the morning, until the drive was over. Eli started staying after supper to help with the cleanup. He had not been asked to. It was not part of his responsibilities. He found, after the first week, that the time after the evening meal when most of the crew was drifting toward their bedrolls was the time he least wanted to be alone with his thoughts. And the chuck wagon was the one place in camp where something was still happening. Wallace did not comment on his presence. He handed Eli a rag and pointed at the Dutch oven. And Eli cleaned the Dutch oven. And that was the arrangement. They talked sometimes, not about large things. Wallace would mention a change in weather he was reading from the afternoon light, or a problem with one of the wagon wheels that needed attention before too long, or the water situation in the next 2 days of travel. Eli listened and asked questions, and Wallace answered them in the minimum number of words required to convey the necessary information. One evening in the second week, Eli was scrubbing the coffee pot and watching Casimiro on the far side of camp. The older man was sitting alone near a wagon wheel, working a piece of leather with a small tool, not doing anything that was obviously about the drive, just sitting, just working with his hands in the firelight. It was the first time Eli had seen Casimiro doing something that was not, strictly speaking, necessary. "How long has he been doing this?" Eli said. Wallace did not ask who he meant. "Casimiro has been working cattle since before I was born," Wallace said. "His father worked cattle. His grandfather worked cattle on land that used to be Mexico and is now Texas. And the name of it changed, but the cattle did not. He moved something in the chuck box and kept talking. Half the words we use out here are his words," Wallace said. "Lasso, Remuda, Stampede. We took the words the same way we took the techniques. Then we forgot where they came from because it was more convenient not to remember." He handed Eli the coffee pot to check. "Pay attention to him," Wallace said. "He will not teach you, but if you watch closely enough, you will learn things that will keep you alive in situations where nothing else will." Eli looked at Casimiro across the camp. "Why will he not teach me?" he said. Wallace considered this. "He has taught many men," he said. "Some of them said thank you. Most did not. After a while, a man stops offering what is not asked for." Eli sat with that for the rest of the evening. He thought about it the next morning while watching Casimiro work the herd from the flank position. The way the older man's horse moved in small adjustments that looked like stillness from a distance. The way Casimiro's attention was distributed across the whole width of the herd at once, rather than focused on any single animal. He did not ask Casimiro to teach him. He watched. That was the beginning of something that would take the rest of the drive to develop, an education conducted entirely in observation and imitation, with no words exchanged about what was being learned or why. One evening near the end of the third week, after the rest of the crew had gone to their bedrolls, Eli stayed at the wagon longer than usual. Wallace was finishing the last of the cleanup, moving with the particular economy of someone winding down a long day. And Eli was stacking the clean pots in their proper places in the chuck box. He had been thinking about something since the incident with the steer 9 days earlier. The way Casimiro had appeared out of the dark and solved the problem with a wide, easy arc, while Eli had made it worse by coming in too tight. "Wallace," he said, "when you came up the trail the first time, did you know what you were doing?" Wallace stopped what he was doing and looked at Eli for a moment. "No," he said. "I knew how to cook. I did not know how to cook for 12 men on a moving wagon in a Kansas summer for 3 months." He went back to what he was doing. Nobody knows what they are doing the first time. The question is whether you pay enough attention to know more the second time. He closed the chuck box. "You paid attention tonight," he said, "with the steer." Eli looked at him. "I got it wrong," Eli said. "Yes," Wallace said. "And you knew you got it wrong before anyone told you. That is not nothing." He picked up the lantern and headed toward the wagon seat where he slept. 4 in the morning, he said over his shoulder. "Coffee will be ready." Eli stood at the chuck wagon alone for a moment. The camp was quiet around him, the herd breathing in the dark beyond the firelight. June, standing at the picket line, with her head low and her weight shifted to one hip, he thought about his father, who had learned the work the same way, by doing it wrong and paying attention to the difference, on land that was not his own, with tools that were not his own, building knowledge that no one was going to hand him, because no one had anything to gain from giving it away for free. Some things did not change much. He went to check on June before turning in. She turned her head toward him when he put his hand on her neck, her ear rotating once in his direction. And then she went back to whatever horses thought about in the dark. 4 in the morning, he told her. She did not seem concerned. The horse in the movie is always the same horse. It is the hero's horse, loyal and fast, carrying its rider through the entirety of the story without visible limitation. In the movies, a man and his horse are a single unit, inseparable. The horse as much a part of the hero's identity as his hat or his gun. On a cattle drive in 1872, that horse would have been used up by the end of the first week. A working horse on the trail carried a rider for 8 to 12 hours a day across difficult terrain in summer heat. Sometimes, at a hard run, when cattle scattered or a situation required speed. This kind of work wore a horse down in ways that were not immediately visible, but were absolutely real. A horse that had done a full day of driving work was a different animal from a horse that had started the morning fresh. And the difference mattered most in exactly the situations when the quality of the horse mattered most. This was why every cattle drive moved with a Remuda. The Remuda was the string of spare horses, driven along with the herd by a cowhand called the wrangler, for a drive of 2,500 cattle with 12 men. The Remuda held between 70 and 100 horses, roughly 8 to 10 per rider. Each cowhand was assigned a personal string from this pool, a group of horses that were his to ride and his responsibility to understand. You did not ride another man's horse. This was not courtesy. It was safety. A cowhand who had been working with his string for several days knew things about each of those horses that could not be communicated in any description. How this one responded to a sudden noise from the left. How that one behaved when cattle pushed close against its flank? Which one needed to be talked to quietly when the lightning started, and which one was steady enough in a storm that you could trust it to make good decisions if your own judgment got overwhelmed? These things were learned through hours of shared work. They did not transfer. A cowhand on an unfamiliar horse in a nighttime stampede was a man working at a serious disadvantage at exactly the moment when he could not afford one. Casimiro chose Eli's string on the second day of the drive. Eli did not know this was happening. He was occupied with his own work when Casimiro walked the Remuda line that morning, and he did not see the older man stop at a particular animal, a roan mare, perhaps 4 years old, and stand beside her for a long time without touching her. He did not see Casimiro step back and watch the way she held her weight, the way her ears tracked sounds from different directions. The quality of her attention to what was happening around her. He only knew about it later. When the wrangler brought him his string and the roan mare was in it, he named her June because the drive had started in June and because his father had named every horse he had ever worked with. It was a habit Eli had absorbed without being taught it. The understanding that naming a thing you depended on was not sentiment, but honesty about the relationship. June was not beautiful in the way illustrated horses were beautiful. She was compact and unremarkable, with a white star on her forehead and one white stocking on her left rear leg. What she had, which Eli did not fully appreciate for the first several days, was a quality of attention that made her exceptionally safe in difficult situations. She noticed things early, when something changed in the environment around the herd. June's response was not panic, but a shift in the quality of her stillness. A specific forward rotation of her ears, combined with a slight tension in the muscles of her neck. Eli learned over the first 2 weeks that when June did that thing with her ears, he should stop whatever he was doing and pay attention to the direction she was looking. This turned out to be valuable information. He asked Wallace about it one evening at the chuck wagon. Why Casimiro had chosen that particular horse for his string. Wallace was cutting salt pork into the bean pot. He did not look up. "What does the horse do when something is wrong?" he said. Eli described the ear movement, the shift in posture. Wallace nodded once. "And you see it in time to do something about it?" "Yes, that is why," Wallace said. He put the lid on the bean pot. "Casimiro has been matching riders to horses for 30 years, he said. "He is not always right, but he is right more often than anyone else I have worked with. And he does not do it by looking at the horse. He does it by looking at the rider." Eli sat with this for a while. Casimiro had assessed him the same morning he had assessed the horses, had looked at him the same way he had looked at the Remuda, with that same quality of unhurried attention, and had made a judgment about what he needed before Eli had known enough to make that judgment himself. He thought about his father, who had told him once that the most useful people in any situation were usually the ones who said the least, because they were spending that time paying attention instead of talking. He looked across the camp to where Casimiro was sitting with his back against a wagon wheel, hat pulled low. He appeared to be asleep. Eli had a feeling he was not asleep. He went to check on June before turning in. She was standing at the edge of the Remuda with that quality of calm attention that was becoming familiar to him, ears moving slowly, taking in the sounds of the night. He stood with her for a moment. He was not thinking about Abilene. He was not thinking about the $70 or the bay horse waiting in Bexar County. He was thinking about the angle Casimiro had used with the steer 11 days ago, and about June's ears, and about the way Casimiro had looked at him that first morning, the way he looked at horses. Something was being asked of him on this drive that he had not known to prepare for. He was not sure yet what it was, but he was paying attention. That, according to both Wallace and his father, was the beginning of most things worth knowing. On the third morning of the drive, before the herd moved out, Denton crouched in the dirt near the chuck wagon and drew a shape with a stick, an elongated oval, wider at the front, narrowing toward the rear. He drew it without preamble, looked at it for a moment, then placed small marks at positions around the outline, 2 marks at the front, 2 on each side, a third of the way back, 2 more, 2/3 of the way back, 2 at the very end. He looked up at the crew. The herd moves in this shape. He said, "You are the shape. If you are not in your position, the shape does not hold. If the shape does not hold, we lose cattle. Losing cattle costs money. Costing money is the one thing on this drive I will not forgive." He pointed at the 2 marks at the front. Point. He named Casimiro and Reed, an Anglo cowhand in his mid-30s who had done 4 previous drives and who Eli had already identified as the most capable of the Anglo riders. By watching, rather than asking, point riders worked at the front of the herd. 1 on each side of the lead cattle. They set the direction of travel. The lead cattle followed them, and the rest of the herd followed the lead cattle. If the point riders turned, the herd turned. If they slowed, the herd slowed. They were the rudder of a vessel made of living animals, each one weighing between 800 and 1,200 pounds, each one capable of its own decisions. And the art of the position was in making the herd believe it was moving freely in a direction it had chosen, when in fact it was being guided. Casimiro at point was like watching someone conduct from inside the orchestra. His movements were so small and so precisely timed that the cattle nearest him appeared not to be responding to him at all. They simply moved in the direction they needed to move. And Casimiro happened to be there beside them. Eli watched this for 2 days before he understood what he was seeing. What he was seeing was the difference between controlling cattle and working with them. Controlling cattle required constant visible input, pushing and directing and correcting. Working with them required understanding how they made decisions as a group and positioning yourself so that the direction you needed was the direction of least resistance. Casimiro did not tell the lead cattle where to go. He arranged himself so that where he needed them to go was the easiest available choice. It was the most efficient thing Eli had ever seen, and it was almost invisible. Swing riders worked on each side of the herd at roughly 1/3 of the way back from the front. Their job was to maintain the width of the moving column, preventing it from spreading too wide or compressing too narrow. Too wide, and individual animals drifted toward the edges and needed collecting. Too narrow, and the cattle became agitated from the pressure of the animals beside them. Flank riders worked 2/3 of the way back, 1 on each side. Their job was to prevent cattle from breaking out of the rear portion of the herd, which tended to be the older and more stubborn animals, the ones that had not fully committed to the direction of travel and were more likely to turn back toward the home range they had left behind. A longhorn that had decided it was going home was not easily persuaded otherwise. And then there was drag. Denton looked at Eli when he said the word. He did not say Eli's name. He did not need to. The position of drag was given to the newest and least experienced rider on the drive. And on this drive, that was Eli. And both of them knew it without it needing to be stated. Drag riders worked at the rear of the herd, behind everything, behind all four positions ahead of them, behind the bulk of 2,500 animals, behind every hoof that had struck the ground since the drive left the home ranch. What they rode through was the accumulated result of all of that. The dust at drag was not the kind of dust that appeared in paintings of cattle drives. The romantic haze that softened the background and gave the whole scene a golden quality. It was a specific physical substance that existed in the air at a density that made breathing a task rather than an automatic function. The color of Texas soil, red-brown, in this part of the country, coating every surface, working its way into fabric and hair and the spaces between teeth. Eli wore his bandana over his nose and mouth from the first morning. It helped the way a screen door helps in a rainstorm. It reduced the problem without solving it. Behind the dust was the smell. 2,500 cattle moving through summer heat generated a combination of odors that the word smell does not adequately describe. At point and swing and flank, this smell was present, but diluted by distance and airflow. At drag, there was no dilution. Eli rode in it for the first week without complaint, because complaining would not change the position. And the position would not change until he had proven himself capable of something better. He used the time to watch from drag, with the entire herd stretched ahead of him. He had a view of the formation that no other position provided. He could see the shape of the moving column, the way it stretched and compressed in response to the terrain. The way changes at the front rippled back through the entire herd over the following minutes. He could see when an animal in the middle of the formation was beginning to act differently from the animals around it. A change in the angle of the head or the direction of movement that, by the time it reached the flank riders, had already developed into a problem. From drag, he could see it starting. He started keeping a mental record of every animal near the rear of the herd. Their individual tendencies, the particular ways they expressed fatigue or the intention to separate from the group. There was a large brindle steer that consistently drifted left. There was a pair of cows that moved as a unit and would stop moving entirely if separated. There was an old longhorn with a notch in his left ear who was perfectly cooperative until late afternoon, at which point something shifted in his thinking, and he became the most likely animal in the rear third to make a sudden turn. Eli learned their schedules the way Wallace had learned the crew's moods, by paying attention to the same information over and over until the patterns became visible. On the 9th day, the notch-eared steer began his late afternoon reassessment. Eli was already moving before the steer had committed to a direction. He positioned June in the path of least resistance. The way he had watched Casimiro position himself at point, not blocking, but redirecting, making the way back to the herd easier than the way away from it. The steer considered this for a moment and returned to the herd. Casimiro was riding flank that afternoon and had seen it. He said nothing. He turned back to his own work. That evening, Denton walked past Eli at the chuck wagon and said, without stopping or looking directly at him, that he would be riding flank tomorrow. Eli said nothing. He refilled his coffee cup and sat with it in both hands and looked at the herd settling in for the night. He felt something that was not pride exactly, but was adjacent to it. The quiet internal acknowledgement of a task done correctly in a situation where doing it correctly had required something real. He thought about his father, who had done difficult work his entire life in conditions that offered no particular acknowledgement of it, and who had found a way to carry that without it becoming bitterness. The dirt drawing Denton had made that first morning was long gone, scuffed out by boots and hooves. But the shape it described was out there in the evening light. 2,500 animals arranged in a formation that 12 men were holding together by their presence and their attention and their knowledge of how cattle moved and why. It was strange and specific work. It was also the only work Eli had ever done that asked everything he knew and then asked for more. 4 in the morning. The sky above the Texas plain is the particular black that exists only in the hour before any light has decided to appear. Stars in every direction, more than you can count, going all the way to the horizon without interruption. Eli is aware of none of this. He is pulling on boots that are cold and damp from the night air, sitting on his bedroll on the ground, working the stiffness out of his fingers enough to manage the laces. He slept in his clothes because taking them off and putting them back on in the cold is a subtraction from sleep that the schedule does not allow. The fire at the chuck wagon is already going. He can smell the coffee before he sees the wagon, and he moves toward the smell in the dark with the focused purposefulness of a man whose body has decided that coffee is the first necessary thing and everything else comes after. Wallace hands him a cup without being asked. Too hot to drink quickly. He drinks it quickly anyway. Around him the crew assembles in the pre-dawn dark with the silence of people who have been awake long enough to know that talking takes energy they have not yet acquired. The Hill Country brothers, who chattered through the first 3 days, have learned to be quiet in the morning. Everyone learns to be quiet in the morning. Biscuits from the Dutch oven, beans from the night before, reheated. Eli eats standing at the wagon because sitting down in a bedroll warm way might communicate to his body that lying back down is an option. It is not an option, not for another 16 hours. By the time the sky shifts from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn, he is in the saddle. June moves under him with the alertness she always has in the morning, ears already doing their slow scan of everything within range. He lets her settle into the rhythm of the start before asking anything particular of her. She does not need management in the morning. She needs acknowledgement. The sense that the person on her back is present and paying attention. And once she has that, she does her own work. The herd begins to move. The sound of 2,500 cattle starting to walk is not a single sound but a layering of them. The low moan of animals being asked to move before they have decided to. The percussion of hooves on dry ground. The knock of horn against horn. The scrape and shift of that much weight transferring from rest to motion. It builds over several minutes into a continuous low roar that is also a vibration felt through June's body and into his own. They are moving at drag. This means the herd is moving away from him, and he is following it into what it leaves behind. By 7 in the morning, the dust has arrived. The accumulated product of 10,000 hooves striking dry Texas soil for several hours does not dissipate in still air. It collects. It builds at drag in a density that changes the quality of the light, turns the air into something you have to negotiate with rather than simply breathe. Eli breathes through his bandana. The bandana lowers the problem from serious to manageable. He accepts manageable. His eyes water, not from emotion, from particulate matter contacting the surface of his eyes continuously. He tilts his head slightly forward, lets the brim of his hat do what it can, blinks, and continues. 10 in the morning. He switches horses, a bay gelding from his string, with more endurance than speed. The transition takes a few minutes while the herd keeps moving. The herd does not pause for the transition. This is one of the realities of the work that does not come through in any description of it. The herd is not a machine that can be stopped and started by the people operating it. It is a biological system with its own momentum, its own internal logic, its own responses to conditions that have nothing to do with what the cowhands need at any given moment. When a rider needs to stop, the herd does not stop with him. When a rider is thirsty or tired or uncertain about a decision, the herd continues its business. There is no pause. None. The herd stops at a creek. Cattle spread along the bank and drink and move off to graze in the grass near the water. Eli dismounts. For the first time since early morning, his legs are stiff in the specific way that comes from hours in the saddle, requiring a conscious decision to walk normally for the first few minutes. He drinks from his canteen, which is warm, and eats what Wallace packed for the midday stop: dried meat and a biscuit that is cooled since morning. He has 4 more hours of driving before camp. He gets back in the saddle, 2 in the afternoon. The notch-eared steer begins his daily reconsideration. Eli is already watching him. He moves June to cut off the available space in the direction the steer is considering. The steer reconsiders and stays with the herd. The whole thing takes 40 seconds and is observed by no one. 4:30, Denton signals the stop. The crew works the herd into the evening position near a flat area with decent grass and access to a spring that Denton identified when he rode ahead during the noon break. Eli unsaddles the bay gelding and brings June for the lighter evening work. The transition accomplished with the practiced efficiency of 2 weeks of doing it the same way. The chuck wagon is already there. The fire is already going. Wallace has the evening meal advancing. 6 in the evening. Supper. Beans. Salt pork mixed in tonight. More than usual. Biscuits. Harder than the morning ones, but still Wallace's biscuits. Coffee. Eli eats all of it without registering much beyond the fact that it is there and his body requires it. He is burning what he eats and eating what he can get, and the equation is currently in balance, but the balance requires everything available to maintain it. 8 in the evening. The first night guard goes out. Eli is not in the first rotation tonight. He takes his bedroll and finds a piece of ground that is reasonably flat. He does not look at the stars. He does not think about Abilene or the $70 or the bay horse in Bexar County. He thinks about his boots, still damp from this morning, which will be damp again when he puts them on at 4 in the morning. He thinks about the notch-eared steer and whether he should try moving from a slightly different angle tomorrow. whether the steer has a preference about direction that Eli has not yet identified. Then he is asleep. He does not dream. He does not have the reserves for it. Somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight. 2,500. Longhorns breathe and shift and settle, doing what they do when no one is asking anything of them. Tomorrow the boots will be damp again, but coffee will be ready at 3:30. The formation will take shape in the pre-dawn dark, and the dust will build, and the day will ask everything the day always asks. That is the whole of what there is to know about drag. The poster never showed it. The poster showed the man against the sunset, the horse, the open land, the freedom. The freedom was real in its way. It just looked like wet boots and $30 a month and a bandana full of dust and one more look at the notch-eared steer before closing your eyes. That is the version no one painted. There was a map. Denton kept it in a leather tube that rode in the chuck wagon, and he took it out in the evenings sometimes and studied it by firelight with the attention of a man reading something he has read many times and is reading again. Not to learn new information, but to confirm what he already knows against what the day has shown him. The map was not detailed in the way that modern maps are detailed. It was a record of routes traveled by previous drives, annotated by the men who had traveled them, water sources, and their reliability by season, stretches of grass that were good in wet years and poor in dry ones, crossing points on the major rivers and the conditions under which each was advisable or dangerous. Some of the annotations were in handwriting that Denton recognized as belonging to men who had died on subsequent drives. He had added his own notes from 9 previous trips, and the map was now a layered document of collective knowledge that no single person had assembled and no single person fully understood. Water was the first variable. A longhorn steer needed between 30 and 50 liters of water each day to maintain its weight and keep moving. Multiply that across 2,500 cattle. Add the needs of roughly 100 horses and 12 men, and the daily water requirement of the drive was a quantity that could empty a small creek in a few hours if the cattle arrived thirsty after a hard push in summer heat. This meant the trail was not a straight line from South Texas to Abilene. It was a route determined by the location of water sources that could reliably supply that daily requirement through June, July, and August. Rivers, creeks, springs, and natural tanks that collected rainwater were the fixed points around which the route organized itself. The straight-line distance from the home ranch to Abilene was approximately 800 miles. The actual route, adjusted for water, was longer. Denton knew every water source on the Chisholm Trail between the home ranch and the Red River. He knew which ones were permanent and which were seasonal, which had been reliable in a dry summer, and which had failed in years when the rain did not come when it should have. He knew which sources were shared with other drives in ways that meant arriving a day behind another herd might mean finding the water already compromised. He did not know all of this with certainty. No one knew it with certainty because water availability was a function of rainfall that no one controlled. And the summer of 1872 had not yet revealed what kind of summer it intended to be. This uncertainty lived in every decision he made about pace and route. Grass was the second variable, and it was connected to the first in ways that made them impossible to consider separately. Cattle ate grass. The math was not complicated, but the amount of grass available along any given section of the trail was a function of how many other drives had already passed through, how much rain had fallen that spring, and how much time the drive could afford at each stop for the cattle to graze. The Chisholm Trail in 1872 was not a private road. It was a corridor of land that dozens of drives used each season. The drives that went first moved through grass that had been growing since the previous fall without being heavily grazed. The drives that went later moved through ground that had been cropped by every herd that went before them. Denton's drive was in the middle of the season's traffic, which meant the grass was adequate but not abundant. If he pushed too hard between water sources to make up time or distance, he risked arriving at the next source with cattle that had been moving in heat without water for longer than was good for their weight. A steer that lost significant body weight between Texas and Abilene sold for less at the railhead. The difference between a well-watered, well-paced herd and a driven, water-stressed one at the point of sale could mean the difference between a profitable season and a marginal one. And the margin on a cattle drive was not wide enough to absorb that difference comfortably. If he moved too slowly to protect the cattle, he risked arriving at Abilene after the peak of market activity, selling into a different price environment than a drive that arrived at the right time. Every day was a negotiation between those two pressures. Every evening Denton made marks in his record book that no one else on the crew fully understood. And every morning the drive moved at a pace and in a direction that those marks had produced. Eli began to understand this in the third week. He had noticed that Denton's decisions about the day's stopping point were never explained in terms of distance. Denton never said they would stop after 12 miles or 15 miles. He said they would stop when he said they would stop. And the point at which he said that was always near water and always near grass. And the amount of grazing time he allowed before pushing the herd on was calibrated to something that Eli could not initially identify. He asked Wallace about it one evening. Wallace was trimming the wick on the lantern he used for late work. "He is watching their ribs," Wallace said. Eli waited. "You can see the condition of a cow in its ribs," Wallace said. "Too much rib showing means the animal is losing weight faster than it should. Not enough rib visible means you can push harder without risk." Denton reads the herd the way a doctor reads a patient. Then he adjusts the pace and the grazing time based on what he sees. He set the lantern down. "The problem," Wallace said, "is that what he sees changes every day, and the water sources do not move to accommodate what he sees. So every decision is a compromise between what the cattle need and what the terrain offers." Eli looked out at the herd, settling in the evening grass. "What happens if he gets it wrong?" he said. "He has gotten it wrong," Wallace said. "Every man who has done this long enough has gotten it wrong. The question is not whether you get it wrong. The question is how wrong and in which direction." He picked up the lantern. "Too slow is better than too fast," he said. "Thin cattle at the railhead is a loss you can calculate. Dead cattle on the trail is a loss you cannot recover from." He went to check something at the wagon. 2 days later, in the late afternoon, Denton came back from a solo ride north and changed the next day's route without comment. The crew adjusted without comment. That was the economy of information on the drive. Denton made the decision. The crew implemented it. The reasons moved between them in neither direction. That evening, Eli noticed Denton studying the map for longer than usual. The Red River was north of them now by a matter of days rather than weeks. Eli had been hearing about the Red River since before the drive left, from men who had crossed it on previous drives, and what they said about it tended toward the same territory. It was the crossing that separated the drives that made it from the drives that did not. It was the place where the trail boss either knew what he was doing or found out that he did not. Denton knew what he was doing. But knowing what you were doing and controlling what the river did were two different things, and the river did not care which column it fell into. Eli filled his canteen before bed that night. He also filled the spare one. The smaller one he usually left empty to save weight. He did not examine the reason too closely. It just seemed like the right thing to do when a man who had crossed 9 rivers was spending extra time with his map. They arrived at the Red River on a Tuesday morning in late June. Denton had not announced they were close. He had not needed to. The land had been making the announcement for 2 days. The terrain flattening toward the north. The vegetation shifting in ways that indicated a major water source ahead. The air carrying something different in the early mornings. A weight that was not present farther south. And then the river was there. The Red River in late June of 1872 was running higher than its name suggested it might. Recent rains upstream, which the crew had not experienced directly, but which Denton had been reading evidence of for a week, had put additional water into the system. What they arrived at was approximately 200 yards across at the crossing point Denton had selected, moving with a speed and a surface turbulence that communicated its nature clearly even to Eli, who had not crossed it before. The water was the color of old brick, carrying the red clay of its upstream banks in suspension. The bottom was not visible from the surface. A sandbar extended from the south bank roughly a third of the way across, visible as a slight lightening of the water's color above it. Beyond that, a deeper channel where the current ran fastest, then a shallower approach to the north bank, partially obscured by the angle of the morning light. Denton rode down to the water alone. He dismounted and walked to the edge and stood there for several minutes. This was longer than Eli had seen him stand still for any purpose since the drive began. He was reading something in the water. The speed of debris moving in the current, the way the surface moved over the sandbar versus the channel, the height of the water against a particular rock that Eli could not see from where he waited with the rest of the crew. He walked back up the bank and mounted. "We crossed this morning," he said. "The water is high, but it will not be lower tomorrow. If there is more rain upstream, it will be higher by the end of the week." He looked at the crew, Casimiro and Reed at point, everyone else in position. When the lead cattle commit to the water, the herd follows. If the lead cattle stop at the bank, we start again. We do not let them stop at the bank. He paused. If you go into the water, stay with your horse. Do not try to fight the current without the horse. The horse can get you across. The current alone will not. No one asked questions. This was the part of the drive that the hiring notice had not described. The notice had said approximately 3 months. Board and meals included. $30 a month. It had not said anything about standing on the south bank of the Red River, looking at 200 yards of red water moving faster than it looked from a distance. With 2,500 cattle and 12 men about to go into it, the preparation took an hour. Denton rode the perimeter of the gathered herd, placing people at specific locations along the bank. Eli was positioned at the rear left, his job to keep the trailing cattle moving forward once the crossing began, to maintain enough pressure from behind that the animals in the rear had no option but to follow those ahead into the water. Casimiro and Reed worked the lead cattle to the water's edge. The key to a river crossing was momentum. A herd that arrived at a river's edge with continuous pressure from behind, with the lead cattle already in the water ahead, would often cross with relatively little incident. The cattle in the middle and rear had no time to think about what they were doing. They were doing it because the animals around them were doing it, and because stopping was not an option the crowd permitted. A herd that stopped at the bank was a different problem entirely. Casimiro and Reed walked their horses into the water without hesitation, moving at a steady pace that communicated to the led cattle that the water was something horses entered voluntarily. The lead steers watched. Their hooves touched the water's edge. They stopped. Eli felt the herd behind him compress as the forward movement ceased, the animals pressing into each other, the cattle nearest him becoming agitated by the pressure and the confusion about why they had stopped. He held his position, keeping June steady between the rear of the herd and the open country behind, presenting no option to the animals immediately ahead of him except forward. Casimiro was in the water, up to his horse's knees, not looking back at the lead cattle, moving forward with the calm of a man crossing a road. One of the lead steers stepped in, then the other, then the animals directly behind them, because the animals directly behind could not see the river, only the backs of the cattle ahead of them. And the cattle ahead were moving. The crossing began. It was orderly for the first 5 minutes. The sandbar held the led cattle at a manageable depth, and by the time they reached the main channel, the mass of cattle behind had built enough forward momentum that the deeper water did not stop them. Cattle swam badly, but they swam, their noses up, their bodies carried sideways by the current, drifting downstream from the crossing line, but making progress toward the north bank. Eli entered the water with the rear of the herd, June moving without hesitation into the shallows and then deeper, her hooves losing the bottom, her body switching to the longer, slower movement of swimming. The current took them sideways. He felt June adjust her angle to compensate, quartering into the flow rather than fighting it directly. The river around him was not what he had expected. It was not violent. It was enormously patient, an indifferent force that did not care about the cattle or the horses or the men or the economics that had brought all of them to this specific point on a Tuesday morning in late June. It simply moved, and everything in it moved with it. And the question was only whether what moved with it ended up on the north bank or somewhere farther downstream. The trouble started near the far side of the main channel. A large cow, spooked by something beneath the surface, or simply overwhelmed by the force of the current at its strongest point, turned sideways and began to drift. The animals nearest her responded to her panic and turned with her. A section of perhaps 30 cattle, caught in the strongest part of the channel, began to circle. The circular motion was the danger. Cattle circling in a river did not swim forward. They churned, each animal pressing against the others. The movement of the group canceling out the movement of the individuals. And a circling mass of cattle in a deep channel tended to sink rather than swim, because the energy that should have been used for forward motion was being used to fight the animals on each side. Dawson was closest to the circling group. Eli watched him assess the situation for perhaps 2 seconds, then ride his horse directly into the edge of the circle, shouting, slapping the water with his hat, using everything available to break the circular motion and redirect the animals toward the north bank. His horse went under for a moment, recovered. Dawson stayed in the saddle. The circle broke. The cattle that had been circling surged forward, disorganized but moving, and the north bank was close enough now that the current had less distance to work against them, and they came out of the water in ones and twos, and then in a rush, hooves finding the gravel of the north bank and lunging up onto it with the exaggerated effort of animals that have just discovered the difference between swimming and standing. Eli came out behind the last of them. He sat on June on the north bank of the Red River and let her breathe and let himself breathe and watched the water moving past the crossing point, carrying nothing now but the color of the upstream clay. Denton was already counting. He counted for a long time, moving along the assembled herd, making marks in his record book. Casimiro moved along the far side, cross-checking the number. When they finished, Denton wrote the final count and said nothing. 28 cattle had not come out on the north bank. Some would be found downstream, some would not. One horse would not be worked again this season. Its leg had found something in the channel bottom that had ended its usefulness for the summer. No men were lost. No men were seriously hurt. Denton wrote this in his book and put the book away. Texas was behind them now. The ground under their feet belonged to a different world than the one they had left on the south bank. A world with its own rules and its own people and its own claim on this land that the cattle were about to walk across. Eli looked north. He had understood this abstractly before the crossing. He understood it differently now, in the specific way you understand things that your body has participated in, rather than your mind alone. He had gone into a river in one world and come out of it in another, and the river between them had not cared about the distinction at all. He wrung out his bandana and put it back on. The drive moved north. The north bank of the Red River looked, at first, like more of the same country they had been crossing for 3 weeks. The grass was the same blue stem and grama that grew in South Texas. The sky was the same sky. The heat was the same heat. The cattle moved north with the same reluctant cooperation they had shown since May. And the cowhands held their positions with the same attention to the same variables they had been tracking since the drive began. But the ground was different. Not in its physical composition. In what it meant, the land north of the Red River was Indian territory. The United States government had designated it as such in the 1830s, when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act and the Army began forcing the 5 tribes from their ancestral lands in the American Southeast, Cherokee from Georgia and Tennessee and North Carolina, Choctaw and Chickasaw from Mississippi and Alabama, Muskogee Creek from Alabama and Georgia, Seminole from Florida. They had been told this land in the West would be theirs. The word used in the treaties was permanently. The land would belong to them permanently, in exchange for the land that had belonged to them for generations and was now wanted by white settlers moving south and west. Permanently had lasted approximately 40 years before the terms began to shift again. By 1872, the 5 tribes had built functioning societies on this land. The Cherokee Nation had a capital at Tahlequah with a Supreme Court and a national newspaper printed in the Cherokee syllabary. The Choctaw Nation had schools. The Chickasaw Nation had an elected legislature. These were not temporary camps. These were established communities of people who had survived forced removal and rebuilt on the other side of it, and who were now watching with the attention of people who had learned that promises did not hold indefinitely. As the pressure on their territory increased every season, cattle drives were part of that pressure. Tens of thousands of Texas cattle passed through Indian Territory every year on their way to the Kansas railheads, moving across grazing land that the tribal nations depended on for their own livestock, using the water sources that the communities along the trail also used, compacting the soil along the trail corridor in ways that changed how the grass grew back. The drives did not pass through empty land. Their passage was negotiated, taxed, tolerated, resisted, and remembered. Denton handled the toll negotiation on the 3rd morning after the Red River crossing. 2 men came out to meet the drive at a point where the trail crossed a well-used east-west path. They were Cherokee, dressed in a mixture of styles that reflected the particular position of the Cherokee Nation in this period. One in a broadcloth coat that would not have looked out of place in a Kansas City office, the other in clothing suited to outdoor work. They carried no visible weapons. They came on horseback and stopped at a distance that was close enough for conversation and deliberate enough to make clear they had chosen it. Denton rode out to meet them without being asked and without taking anyone with him. Eli watched from his position at flank. The conversation lasted perhaps 15 minutes. He was too far away to hear the words, but he could read the structure of it from the posture and movement of the 3 men. A period of formal exchange that looked like acknowledgement. A period of what appeared to be disagreement, not hostile, but substantive. The kind that happens when 2 parties have different starting positions on a number. A period of final terms. Denton rode back. 10 cents ahead, he said, to no one in particular, plus 2 steers at the end of the count. Their choice. He did not editorialize. He said it the way he said most things on the trail, as information that needed to be known and that required nothing further from him. The 2 Cherokee men rode slowly along the side of the herd, counting. One of them kept a tally on a folded piece of paper with a stub of pencil. They were thorough and unhurried, and their count, when compared to Denton's count from the morning, was within 3 animals of matching. There was a brief conversation about the 3 animals. They arrived at a number. They selected their 2 steers from the middle of the herd. Large animals, healthy and well-conditioned. The choice was made with the eye of people who knew cattle. Then they left, the 2 steers moving ahead of them, heading east on the path they had come from. Eli watched them go. That evening, he asked Wallace what he knew about the territory and the people in it. Wallace was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how much of what he knew was useful to say. The Cherokee were in Georgia, he said finally, in North Carolina, in Tennessee. For longer than any written record goes back, they had towns, they had farms. Some of them had built houses and schools that would not have looked different from what you would see in Ohio. He moved something in the chuck box. The government told them to leave in 1838. The army came and made them leave in the middle of winter. About a quarter of them died on the way here. He was quiet again. Then they built all of it again. And now we are walking 2,500 cattle across their pasture land and paying them 10 cents a head for the privilege. And we will be through in 3 days. And they will still be here after we are gone, watching the next drive come through. And the one after that. He closed the chuck box. I am not saying we should not be here, he said. I am saying it is worth knowing what here is, before you walk across it like it is nothing. Eli had thought about that through the evening and into the night. He was a black man in 1872, riding across land that had been taken from people who had been promised it would not be taken. He knew something about the distance between what was promised and what was delivered. He knew it from his father's life, from the life that had preceded his father's life, from the particular quality of freedom that existed in Texas in 1872, for a man who had been freed 7 years earlier with no land and no capital and no structural support beyond the fact that no one was legally permitted to own him anymore. He was not the same as the people whose land this was. His history was not their history, and he did not mistake it for theirs, but he recognized the shape of it. He thought about the way the 2 Cherokee men had conducted themselves during the negotiation with Denton, the self-possession of it. They had not asked for the toll. They had stated it. They had not deferred to Denton's authority over the drive because Denton's authority over the drive was not their concern. They had exercised their own authority over their own land, in the measured way of people who knew that what they had was worth protecting carefully because they had already lost things they were told were protected and were not. On the last evening in the territory, Eli asked Casimiro what he thought about the land they had been crossing. Casimiro was working a piece of leather and did not look up for a long time. Then he said, in the careful English he used when he wanted to be understood precisely, my grandfather's people were told the same thing. This land is yours. Then someone else wanted it. He pulled the leather taut. It is the same story, he said. Different people? Same story. He went back to his work. Eli sat with that for the rest of the evening. He thought about what it would mean to watch strangers walk cattle across land you had built your life on, season after season, and to know that the strangers were not the last strangers, that more would come after them, that the direction of things was visible, even if the end of it was not yet. He thought about the 2 steers the Cherokee men had led east that morning, chosen carefully, with the eye of people who understood what they were owed and took it accordingly. He did not come to a conclusion that satisfied him. He was not sure one was available. The next morning the drive crossed into Kansas. The territory was behind them. What it had been did not change because they had left it. The rotation was simple. 3 shifts of 2 riders each, spaced through the night. Roughly 9 in the evening to midnight. Midnight to 3 in the morning. 3 to 6. Every rider took 1 shift per night, regardless of what the day had required of him. You did not negotiate your shift. You did not trade it. You rode it. Eli drew the 2nd shift most often, midnight to 3, which required the most difficult waking, coming out of the deepest part of sleep at a time when the body had its strongest opinion about staying where it was. Wallace would come and put a hand on his shoulder in the darkness. No words, just the pressure of a hand. and Eli would be up and moving before he was fully awake, because the interval between the hand on the shoulder and the saddle was not an interval for deliberation. The purpose of night guard was straightforward. A herd of 2,500 longhorns at rest was not actually at rest. The cattle did not sleep the way horses slept, dropping into deep unconsciousness that removed them from their surroundings. They lay down and dozed, but their awareness of the environment persisted at a low level. A continuous monitoring of sound and smell and moving air that was the product of being prey animals in a world that contained things that wanted to eat them. This awareness was the night guard's tool and its problem simultaneously. It was the tool because it meant the cattle would respond to the presence of the night riders. A human voice, moving steadily around the perimeter of the herd at regular intervals, communicated something to the cattle's monitoring system that was not precisely safety, but was the absence of alarm. The familiar sound of a known presence, moving in a known pattern, which the resting herd registered and found unremarkable. It was the problem because it meant the cattle would also respond to everything else. A coyote calling from half a mile away, a change in wind direction that carried a new smell to the nearest animals, a piece of brush moving in a way that produced the wrong sound at the wrong moment. Any of these things, in the wrong combination at the wrong time, could move through the resting herd like electricity through water, arriving at the far end before anyone at the near end had understood what had started. The night riders sang to prevent this. Eli had heard about this before the drive and had thought, when he heard about it, that it was probably embellishment. Men crooning to cattle in the dark sounded like the kind of detail that got added in the retelling to make the story worth telling. It was not embellishment. It was function. The cattle needed to know where the night rider was at all times. A moving sound, continuous and recognizable, that circled the herd at the same pace and the same direction, told the nearest animals where the night rider was without requiring them to look. Looking required waking. The sound could be processed without waking. A herd that processed the night rider's presence without waking was a herd that stayed down, stayed calm, and did not give anyone reason to worry until morning. The songs were not the songs of the legend. They were whatever the rider had in his head when he rode out at midnight, after a full day's work, in the dark, over unfamiliar ground, with the responsibility of keeping 2,500 animals calm, sitting on him as the only person awake and moving within a quarter mile in any direction. Eli rode his first full night shift in the second week after the Red River crossing. He went out at midnight into a darkness that was complete except for the stars, which in this part of the country and at this distance from any settlement were numerous enough that the sky had more light in it than the ground. He rode the perimeter of the sleeping herd at a walk, June moving with the careful attention she brought to nighttime work, placing her feet with more deliberation than she used in the day. He did not know what to sing. He had not prepared for this. He had known it was coming and had not thought to prepare. And now he was out here at midnight, with the cattle breathing around him and the darkness complete, and June's hooves making soft sounds in the grass, and he needed to make a sound. He hummed a melody from a hymn he had heard in the church in Bexar County, where his mother had taken him as a child. A simple tune in a minor key that he did not remember the words to, and was not certain he had ever known completely. He hummed it into the dark, and June's ears moved once toward the sound and then relaxed, which he took as confirmation that the sound was acceptable. The cattle nearest him did not stir. He kept humming and kept riding. The perimeter of a resting herd of that size was roughly half a mile around, and at a walk, it took approximately 20 minutes to complete a full circuit. He did this for 3 hours. 9 circuits, more or less. Each one the same distance in the same direction, past the same sleeping cattle. He was alone in a way that was different from any other kind of alone he had experienced. In the city, alone meant the absence of specific people with the ambient presence of a populated world audible at the edges. On the drive during the day, alone meant a momentary separation from the crew that the work quickly ended. This was different. He was the only person awake, possibly for a significant radius. The thought was not frightening. It was simply large, too large to hold all at once. So he held the part of it that was useful, which was the immediate present, the sound of June's hooves, the visible edge of the herd in the starlight, the direction he was riding, and the direction he needed to keep riding. Around the first hour, he noticed something. The cattle nearest him on each pass had begun to recognize the circuit. Not consciously, not through any decision-making, but their awareness of his approach had become anticipatory rather than reactive. The animals awake enough to notice him did not stir at his approach. They registered his presence and returned to dozing. Because his presence at this point in the circuit was expected. He was becoming part of the rhythm of their night. He thought about what Wallace had said, about how food at the right moment could hold a crew together through things that would otherwise pull them apart. He thought about what Casimiro had shown him, that working with an animal rather than against it required understanding the animal's own logic and operating within it rather than imposing something external. He thought about the hymn he was humming, which had been sung in a church in Bexar County by people who had found in that particular combination of melody and repetition, and gathered presence something that held them together in conditions that did not otherwise offer much holding. He was not certain the cattle were receiving the humming the way those people had received the hymn, but they were not running. They were lying in the grass, breathing steadily, and his job was to keep it that way, and he was keeping it that way. Near the end of the third hour, June's ears moved forward and held there, not the relaxed rotation of casual alertness, the forward fixed attention of a horse that has identified something specific. Eli stopped humming. He listened. A sound from the northwest, at the edge of what he could hear. That could have been wind through brush, or could have been something moving through it. June stood very still beneath him. Both ears pointed at the same location. Her breathing slightly altered. The cattle nearest him were awake now, heads raised, their own attention oriented in the same direction June's was. Eli sat on June and listened to the dark, and held himself quiet and waited for the sound to become something identifiable. A coyote called once from somewhere north of the herd, a long descending note, and then was silent. The cattle's heads stayed up for another 30 seconds. Then, on by on, they went back down. June's ears relaxed. Eli let out a breath he had not been fully aware of holding. He began humming again. The rest of the shift was quiet. When the next rider came out at 3 in the morning to relieve him, Eli rode back to camp and unsaddled June and was in his bedroll before he had formed a complete thought about anything. He slept. Around him, the cattle continued their slow, patient breathing in the dark. The next night, Ryder began his first circuit. The herd stayed down. Some things worked because they were repeated, because the repetition itself was the point, because what the cattle needed was not excitement or novelty, but the reliable presence of something moving steadily in the dark and making a sound that meant nothing in particular was wrong. Eli understood this better at 3 in the morning, after 9 circuits of a sleeping herd, than he would have understood it from any description. Some things you had to do before you knew what they were. It happened on a Thursday. Eli knew it was Thursday because he had been counting days since the Red River crossing, not obsessively, but as a practical matter, the way you keep track of where you are in any long piece of work that has a fixed end. They were 5 weeks past the crossing. They were perhaps 3 weeks from Abilene. The drive was in its middle passage, the long stretch between the dramatic events of the beginning and the resolution of the end. And Thursday had felt like a day with nothing particular to distinguish it from Wednesday or from what Friday would likely be. The sky changed at 7 in the evening, not gradually. The sky in this part of the country did not always change gradually. What had been clear in the west at 6 was something different at 7. A darkness moving in from the northwest that had a purposeful quality, as though it had somewhere specific to be and was moving there with conviction. Denton saw it before anyone else mentioned it. He was at the chuck wagon when the light changed, and he came out from under the canvas awning and stood looking northwest with his hands at his sides and his face communicating nothing. Then he walked to his horse and mounted without a word and rode to the perimeter of the herd. Eli watched this from across the camp. He had learned to read Denton's silences. Denton moving to his horse without speaking was not the same as Denton moving to his horse after saying where he was going. The first meant that what he was doing was self-evident to him, and he saw no reason to explain it. When something was self-evident to Denton, it was usually because it was urgent. Eli went to his horse. The night guard rotation had not started yet. The herd was settled from the day's drive, distributed across a wide area of good grass near a creek. The cattle, in the relaxed configuration of animals that had eaten and drunk and were beginning to think about lying down, this was normally the most stable time of day for the herd, the window between the work of moving and the beginning of the night, when the cattle were tired and full and had the fewest reasons to do anything unexpected. The darkness from the northwest arrived faster than Eli had expected. With it came the wind. The wind changed direction 3 times in 5 minutes. Not normal wind behavior. Eli registered this in the part of his awareness that 2 months of driving had trained to notice deviations from the expected. Wind that changed direction that quickly was being pushed around by something large moving through the atmosphere above it. And the something large moving above it was now visible as a wall of cloud that had eliminated the horizon to the northwest and was continuing to eliminate everything between itself and where they stood. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes. The kind of drop the body registers as wrong before the mind has finished processing what is causing it. The cattle felt it. Eli could see the change move through the herd from his position. a shift in the collective posture of the animals, heads coming up, ears orienting northwest. The relaxed configuration of a few minutes ago, tightening into something more attentive. The cattle that had been lying down stood up, not all at once, in a wave. The animals nearest, the approaching weather responding first, and the response spreading back through the herd like a sound from its source. Denton was riding the perimeter, not fast, not in a way that communicated alarm to the cattle, but continuously, his presence a signal that the people responsible for them were present and aware. Two other riders had joined the perimeter without being told. Eli brought June to the edge of the herd and held there. Watching, the lightning started. The first bolt was distant enough that the thunder arrived several seconds later. A low roll that spread across the flat country and seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from a specific direction. The cattle's heads went up another degree. Their breathing became audible from where Eli was sitting. He began talking to June in a low, continuous murmur. Not words, exactly. A sound that told her he was present and paying attention. She was already tense beneath him, her body carrying the charged quality of a prey animal whose instincts were telling her something that her training was telling her to override. The second lightning bolt was closer. The thunder came 5 seconds later. The cattle did not run at the thunder. They ran at the third bolt, which struck the ground perhaps a quarter-mile to the northwest, with a crack that carried no meaningful interval between flash and sound. A simultaneous explosion of light and noise that hit the nervous systems of 2,500 animals as the specific signal their evolutionary history had encoded as run. They ran. The sound of a stampede beginning was not what Eli had imagined before he experienced it. He had imagined something that built a rising noise, that gave you time to understand what was happening before it arrived at full intensity. The reality was that the full intensity was immediate. 2,500 cattle, moving from stillness to full flight, produced a sound and a ground vibration that arrived together. And the arrival was the stampede. June leaped forward before Eli consciously directed her. This was the correct response. A horse standing still in the path of a stampeding herd was a horse that would be run over, and June's instincts on this question were better calibrated than any instruction Eli could have given her in the time available. She ran not away from the herd but alongside it, quartering northwest toward the front of the running cattle. Because the only way to have any effect on a stampede was to get ahead of it and turn it. And getting ahead of it required running faster than it in the same direction. Eli bent low over June's neck and let her run. The darkness was nearly complete. The lightning was the only illumination, coming in flashes that showed him everything for a fraction of a second and then took it away. In those fractions, he saw the herd running in a mass beside him. The cattle's eyes white at the edges, their horns catching the lightning in quick metallic flashes. He saw another rider ahead of him, someone who had gotten northwest faster. He saw the open country in front of the running cattle, flat and empty, and offering nothing that would stop them. Between the flashes, he rode at full speed over ground he could not see. June did not slow down. This was what Casimiro had understood months ago when he had walked the Remuda line and stopped beside this particular horse. A horse that lost its head in darkness and chaos was a dead horse and a dead rider. June was running at full speed over ground she could not see, in conditions designed by the weather to be as frightening as possible. And she was doing it without losing the quality of attention that made her useful. Her ears moved constantly, processing sound in the darkness, compensating for what her eyes could not give her. Eli trusted her. He had not known, when he started trusting her in the small, ordinary situations of the first weeks, that the trust was being built toward something like this. He had not known that 10,000 small moments of learning her signals and responding to them were a preparation for a specific night. He knew it now, running in the dark toward the front of a stampeding herd, because the trust was there without him having to manufacture it. And without it, he would have been fighting the rains, and June would have been fighting him, and neither of them would have been anywhere useful. He was near the front of the herd. He could tell by the change in the sound around him, the way the pounding of hooves on his right was beginning to thin as fewer cattle ran beside him and more ran behind. The led animals were there, the ones who had set the direction of flight, and June was pulling even with them. A lightning flash showed him Casimiro on the other side of the led cattle, already there, already working the turn. Turning a stampeding herd required two riders working the led animals from opposite sides, pushing the front of the herd into a curve that gradually became a circle, forcing the lead cattle to arc around until they were running parallel to the cattle that had been behind them. The front and back of the herd meeting, the circular motion slowing the whole mass, the way a spinning top slows. Energy, canceling energy until the movement became manageable. Casimiro was on the left side of the led cattle. Eli took the right. He pushed June into the space between the led cattle and the open country ahead, not cutting them off, but occupying the space to their right, presenting himself as a presence that the lead cattle would curve away from. June held her position without being asked, understanding what was needed, the way she understood things that were instinct refined by experience. The led cattle began to curve left. The curve was slow at first, almost imperceptible, a degree or two of direction change that propagated back through the running herd over the following seconds. Each animal following the animal ahead, the entire mass beginning to arc. Lightning came again. In the flash, Eli saw the curve happening. He saw the front of the herd and the back of the herd approaching each other at an angle. He saw Casimiro on the far side, steady, neither pushing too hard nor giving ground. The circle closed. The herd ran into itself. The collision of the front and back of a circling stampede was not violent in the way of a crash. It was more like a compression, the running animals meeting resistance from the animals they had been running beside a moment ago. The resistance slowing them, the slowing spreading through the mass until the run became a trot, and the trot became a walk, and the walk became the confused milling of cattle that had been running hard and did not quite know why they had stopped. The lightning was moving east. The worst of the storm was passing. Eli brought June to a halt and sat in the dark and listened to the herd slow around him. His hands were not entirely steady on the reins, not from fear alone, from the physical expenditure of the last 20 minutes, which had asked everything his body had and had received it and left him on the other side of it with the particular emptiness that follows maximum effort. June was breathing hard, but standing steady, her head low, recovering. Other riders arrived, holding positions around the outer edge of the settling herd, maintaining the boundary that would keep them together through the rest of the night. No one spoke above what the work required. Wallace had the fire going when Eli rode back to camp near midnight. The coffee was ready. Eli dismounted and tended to June before he did anything else, checking her legs in the firelight, running his hands down each one, feeling for heat or swelling or any sign that a hard run on dark ground had cost her something. She stood patiently through the examination, too tired to be anything but cooperative. Her legs were clean. He rubbed her down with the dry cloth he kept in his saddlebag, working over her neck and shoulders and the length of her back, and she leaned into the pressure of it the way she did when something felt good to her. "Good," he said to her. One word. She turned her head and looked at him with one large dark eye, and then looked away. He got his coffee and sat near the fire. Denton came in 20 minutes later and went to his record book. The count in the morning would take time. Some cattle had run farther than others and would need to be located in the surrounding country. Some would not be found. The accounting would show what the night had cost, and the accounting would go into the record book, and the record book would travel with the drive to Abilene and become part of the final report to the man who owned the herd. Eli did not think about any of that. He thought about the darkness at full run, and June's ears moving in it, and the moment when the lead cattle began to curve and he had known, not from thinking, but from something below thinking, that the turn was going to work. He finished his coffee and lay down. The stars had come back out above him, the storm having moved east and left the sky clean behind it. The cattle breathed in the dark. The stars moved slowly overhead, the same stars that had been above this ground long before any of them arrived, and would be above it long after all of them were gone. The drive had survived another night. Denton's record book would say 67 cattle lost, recovered or not. It would not say anything about Eli and June running in the dark toward the front of a stampede that needed to be turned. That was not the kind of thing that went into record books. It was the kind of thing that went into the body and stayed there. Week 7. The drive was in Kansas now, moving through the tall grass prairie that stretched north without apparent end. The grass high enough in places to brush the belly of a horse. The sky above it, the wide, flat blue of a country that had decided not to put any hills between the ground and the horizon. It was beautiful country. Eli had stopped seeing it around day 30. This was not a failure of perception. It was an adaptation. The human eye and the human mind, confronted with the same landscape day after day, stop processing what does not change. The beauty of the Kansas prairie was real. It simply had nothing new to tell him, and his attention had migrated entirely toward the things that changed. The condition of the cattle, the behavior of the herd, the movement of clouds that sometimes meant weather and sometimes meant nothing. Week 7 was when the long middle declared itself. There was no event to mark it, no single day that was different from the days before or after. Week 7 arrived, and in arriving revealed something that the earlier weeks, with their river crossings and their storms and their ongoing process of learning how everything worked, had obscured: the mathematics of endurance. A cattle drive was not a series of dramatic events connected by travel. It was primarily travel, with dramatic events distributed sparsely across it. The Red River crossing had taken one morning. The Stampede had taken one night. Everything else had been the work of moving cattle north at 10 to 15 miles per day, through conditions that were demanding without being exceptional, day after day, without interruption. The men who made the best cowhands, Eli was learning, were not the men who performed best in the dramatic events. Those men were visible, and the events were memorable, and the stories afterward were about those men in those moments. But the men who made the best cowhands in the full accounting of a 3-month drive were the men who performed consistently in the days between the events. The long succession of ordinary days that constituted the majority of the drive, and that received no stories because nothing happened in them worth a story. Consistency in those days required something that was not courage or skill in the conventional sense. It required the ability to do the same things correctly, at the same standard, when doing them correctly produced no reward, and doing them poorly would not be noticed until the consequences arrived much later. Eli had learned to count things. He counted the circuits of the night guard. He counted the days since the last significant water source, and the days until the next one on Denton's mental map. He counted the days remaining to Abilene, adjusting the number each morning based on the previous day's distance. He counted the ribs of the cattle nearest him, checking the condition of the herd against the baseline he had established 2 weeks earlier. The counting gave the days shape. Without it, the days had a tendency to blur together in a way that was not peaceful but disorienting. The sameness of them becoming a pressure with nowhere to go. The homesickness came in the 7th week. He had expected it earlier and been mildly surprised when it did not come in the first 2 weeks. Instead, it had waited, arriving not as a sharp longing but as a low, persistent awareness, like a sound at the edge of what you can hear that you cannot quite locate. It was not homesickness for a place. The house in Bexar County, where he had grown up, was not a place he was desperate to return to. It was something more specific than that, a conversation that had history behind it, food made by someone who knew what he liked, sleep in a place that stayed in the same location that he could find in the dark without thinking. His father, Thomas Collum, had died in the winter of 1870, 2 years before the drive, from something in his chest that came on gradually and then all at once. Eli had been 16. He thought about him now, in the long middle, with a frequency that surprised him, not in a way that impaired his work, but in the way you think about someone when you are doing something they would have recognized, when the work itself creates a proximity to the person who taught you the work. His father had known cattle. He had known horses. He had known the management of endurance that these weeks required, had practiced it every day of his working life, without calling it by any particular name, without having anyone acknowledge it as skill. He had done the work, and then done it again the next day and the day after that, because that was the structure of a working life, and because the work was what he had. Eli thought about what his father would have made of this drive. He thought his father would have recognized all of it, not the specific trail or the specific cattle or the specific crew, the mathematics of it, the daily negotiation between what the work required and what the body had available, the accumulation of small, correct decisions that constituted a working life, the fact that the work did not care about the person doing it, but that the person doing it could still find something in the work worth caring about. One evening, in the 8th week, Wallace produced something unexpected for supper. He had traded at a small settlement they passed that afternoon, exchanging a portion of the drive's reserve flour for vegetables from the settlement's garden. The result appeared on the tailgate of the chuck wagon at supper time as a quantity of fresh onions and a collection of turnips that Wallace had roasted in the coals. The crew looked at the turnips the way people look at things they have been without long enough to have forgotten how much they wanted them. No one said much. The saying would have been inadequate. Men who had been eating beans and dried meat and biscuits for 8 weeks did not describe what fresh roasted turnips tasted like. They ate them. Eli ate his portion slowly, which was unusual for him at supper time, because he wanted to be present for it. The onions were sharp and real, in a way that the preserved food had stopped being. The turnips had a sweetness that the trail rations did not approximate. These were the tastes of something still alive in some cellular sense. Food that had not had its complexity extracted by the process of preservation. He had not known how much he missed this until it was in front of him. Around the fire that evening, something loosened in the crew. 2 of the Anglo cowhands got into a conversation that went on longer than conversations usually did in the 7th or 8th week. The Hill Country brothers were audible from across the camp. Casimiro sat by the fire after supper without immediately returning to whatever task usually occupied his evenings, and stayed there long enough that Eli noticed it as a departure from the usual pattern. He did not know what Casimiro was thinking. He had stopped trying to know what Casimiro was thinking and had replaced that effort with watching what Casimiro did, which was more informative and more honest as a method. What Casimiro did that evening was sit by the fire for an extra 20 minutes. Eli thought maybe that was enough. He thought about his father sitting by a fire somewhere, at the end of a long day of work that had not asked anyone's permission before taking what it needed from him. He thought about the bay horse in Bexar County and the $70 and the owner who had set a price and a deadline. Abilene was 2 weeks ahead of them. 2 weeks was a different kind of number than 4 or 6 weeks had been. 2 weeks was within the range of ordinary planning. 2 weeks was the distance between one thing and the next in a life that had normal margins, which this life did not. But the proximity of it was real regardless. Eli put on his boots. The drive moved north. Some things you endured, not because you had a particular gift for endurance, but because the enduring was the only available path between where you were and where you needed to be. And the thing you needed was real enough to be worth the path. The bay horse was real. The $70 was real. Abilene was 2 weeks ahead. He put one foot in front of the other, and the days moved the way days moved when you were counting them, one at a time, each one subtracting from the total, until the total became something you could actually see the end of. There was no doctor between the Red River and Abilene. This was not an oversight. It was the structure of the thing. A cattle drive was a mobile operation moving through country that did not have the population density required to support medical practice. And even if it had, the drive would not have been in any one place long enough to access it. The nearest physician to any given point on the trail was typically a day's ride away in a direction the drive was not going. And a day's ride away was, for most of the injuries and illnesses the trail produced, both too far and too slow. Wallace handled it. This was not listed in his job description because his job description, to the extent one existed, was cook. But Wallace had served in the Union Army for 3 years and had been present at Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge and several smaller engagements that history did not bother to name. and the army had taught him things about keeping injured men functional that no formal medical training would have covered in quite the same way. The army's medicine in those years was the medicine of large numbers of men sustaining injuries at rates that exceeded the capacity of trained physicians to treat them. And the result was a practical knowledge distributed throughout the ranks of men who had been present long enough to observe and assist. Wallace kept a section of the chuck wagon dedicated to what he called the medical supply, though the inventory would not have impressed a physician. Carbolic acid for cleaning wounds, lengths of clean cloth for bandaging, a bottle of laudanum for pain serious enough to require it. Used carefully, because the supply was finite and the trail was long. Needles and thread for closing wounds that needed closing. Whiskey, which served multiple purposes. Willow bark, which he brewed into a tea that reduced fever and managed the lower range of pain. The rest was judgment. The injuries came in patterns. Falls from horses were the most common serious injury on the drive. A working cowhand spent 10 to 12 hours a day in the saddle, under conditions that periodically required fast and unpredictable movement. And the intersection of fast, unpredictable movement with the variable surface of trail country produced falls at a rate that everyone on the drive accepted as part of the work. Most falls produced bruising and soreness that the rider worked through. Some produced sprains, some produced broken bones. A broken bone on a cattle drive was an accounting problem as much as a medical one. The person with the broken bone could not do his job at full capacity, which meant the people around him were doing slightly more of theirs to compensate. This reduction had to be absorbed without complaint, because complaining about it would not change the mathematics, and the mathematics were what they were. Rope injuries were specific to the work, and specific in their character. A lasso thrown at speed that looped wrong. A dally taken around the saddle horn at the wrong moment. A length of rope moving at the speed of a running animal that contacted a hand or a wrist. These produced the particular injuries of working with rope under tension, the burns and compressions and, in the worst cases, the amputations that were the permanent record of what happened when the physics of rope and weight and movement intersected unfavorably with human anatomy. There was a cowhand on the drive named Peters who had 4 fingers on his right hand. He had lost the 5th on a previous drive and had gone back to work afterward because the work was what he had and 4 fingers were enough to do it. Disease was more complicated than injury because it was less visible in its early stages and more variable in its course. The most pervasive condition on the drive was not a disease with a name. It was the accumulated deficit of weeks of hard physical work on insufficient sleep and an inadequate diet. A general reduction in the body's capacity to function at full efficiency that was so universal and so consistent that the crew had stopped perceiving it as a condition and had reclassified it as normal. They were all tired in a way that a week of rest would not have fully resolved. They were all running a deficit in the nutrients that fresh food provides, and dried and preserved food does not. They were all carrying small injuries that had not healed completely because the schedule did not provide for complete healing. This baseline reduced everyone's tolerance for additional difficulty. Eli noticed the change in his gums around the 6th week. Not dramatic. A tenderness that had not been there before. A sensitivity to hot coffee and cold water that developed gradually enough that he did not notice it until it was significant. He mentioned it to Wallace one evening. Wallace looked at him with the expression of a man receiving information he had been expecting. "Eat this," he said, and handed Eli a piece of dried fruit from a small supply he kept in the back of the chuck wagon, separate from the general provisions. Eli ate it. "When did you last have anything fresh?" Wallace said. Eli thought about it. 3 weeks. At least. There had been some wild onion near a creek that one of the crew had found and brought into camp, and everyone had eaten a small portion, and that had been the last thing that qualified as fresh. The body needs things that are not in beans and bacon, Wallace said. After enough weeks without them, it starts to make that known. He gave Eli another piece of dried fruit. "I have a limited supply. I will give you some each day. It will not fix the problem, but it will slow it down until we reach Abilene." He went back to what he had been doing. "Eat the fruit," he said. A cowhand named Briggs broke 2 ribs in the 4th week after the Red River crossing. He was working the flank position when his horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole. The horse went down onto its front knees, recovered quickly. But the recovery was a sudden, violent lurch that threw Briggs forward over the horse's neck and down onto the ground at a speed and angle that his ribs received before anything else did. He lay on the ground for a moment. Then he got up. The drive had not stopped. The cattle nearest him had moved around the fallen horse and rider with the mild inconvenience of water moving around a stone, and the formation had closed behind him. He got back on his horse and returned to his position. He did not tell anyone about his ribs that evening. Eli found out the next morning, because he was at the chuck wagon when Briggs moved in a way that was not how a person with healthy ribs moved. A protective adjustment in how he turned that was visible to anyone paying attention. "Ribs," Eli said quietly. Briggs looked at him. "2 of them, maybe 3, Briggs said. "Not much anyone can do about it." He poured his coffee. "Does Wallace know?" Eli said. "He will, when I can't hide it anymore," Briggs said. "Until then I can ride." He rode for 4 more days before Wallace noticed and made him stop pretending. The treatment for broken ribs on a cattle drive was limited. Wallace wrapped them with cloth strips, pulled tight enough to provide some support and reduce the movement that produced pain. He gave Briggs a measured amount of laudanum for the nights. When lying still, in a bedroll, still produced pain that disrupted sleep. And sleep was necessary for everything else. He assigned him lighter duties where the work permitted. Briggs rode the chuck wagon for a week, sitting beside Wallace on the wagon seat, which transmitted every variation in the ground directly to the person sitting on it. He did not complain about this. He had been on drives before, and he understood the accounting. The ribs were a variable in the crew's capacity, and the way to minimize their impact on the crew's capacity was to do what he could do and not amplify the problem with complaints that changed nothing. Eli thought about this in the days after Briggs's injury. He thought about what it meant to work in a context where the body's limitations were a logistical matter as much as a personal one, where a broken rib was absorbed by the people around you as a redistribution of work rather than a cause for concern about your well-being, where the appropriate response to pain that did not prevent you from functioning was to continue functioning. He had grown up with this understanding in a different form. His father had worked through pain he did not mention because not mentioning it was how you kept the job, and keeping the job was how you kept everything that depended on the job. Eli had absorbed this without being taught it formally. The way you absorb the things that are demonstrated to you every day before you are old enough to understand what you are learning. The trail had its own version of the lesson, a harder version, administered without ceremony and accepted without ceremony. Because ceremony was a luxury that the schedule did not support. He checked June's legs every evening regardless of what the day had been, running his hands down, each one in the same order, feeling for heat or swelling or anything that should not be there. She tolerated this with the patience of an animal that had learned what the gesture meant and associated it with nothing bad following it. Her legs were always fine. He was grateful for this in a way he could not have articulated if someone had asked him, a gratitude that was partly about the horse and partly about the fact that something was fine. That, in the running accounting of things that the trail was using up and things that were holding, June was consistently in the column that held. He thought about the bay horse in Bexar County. He thought about it the way he thought about things that were real and waiting rather than things he was hoping for. The bay horse was in a stable south of San Antonio with a price on it and a deadline attached to the price. He had $50 in the lining of his coat. He had wages accumulating for 3 months of work. The numbers were going to work out. He had done this arithmetic so many times that it had stopped being uncertain and had become simple future fact. A thing that would happen, because the conditions for it happening had been established, and he had not done anything to disturb those conditions. He just had to get to Abilene. The body would hold until Abilene. He would make it hold. They smelled it before they saw it. Not an unpleasant smell, or not entirely. It was the smell of a town, which, after nearly 3 months of smelling nothing but grass and cattle and camp smoke and the specific combination of odors that constituted trail life, registered as something foreign and complicated. Wood smoke from many fires, horses in number, different from the smell of the Remuda, because these were town horses, standing in liveries and at hitching posts, cooking smells from buildings, the background presence of several thousand people living in a concentrated space. Eli was riding near the front of the drive for the first time, moved there by Denton that morning, for reasons that were not explained, but that Eli understood to be related to the challenges of bringing a large herd through the approach to a railhead town without losing cattle to the distractions of the unfamiliar environment. After nearly 3 months, Denton trusted his judgment with the led animals in ways that had not been the case when Eli was riding drag in South Texas. He saw the town take shape ahead of him in the mid-morning light. Abilene, in the summer of 1872, was not a large town by the standards of older American cities. It had perhaps 3,000 permanent residents, a number that expanded considerably during the driving season when the herds arrived, and the cowhands arrived with them, and the businesses that existed to serve the cowhands ran at full capacity. It had a main street with saloons and hotels and dry goods stores and a bank and a land office. It had stockyards at the railroad where the cattle would be penned and weighed and sold. It had been built almost entirely for the purpose it was currently serving. The stockyards were at the edge of town, and Denton guided the drive to them with the precision of someone who had made this arrival before and who had already sent word ahead so that the buyers knew to be present and the pens were ready. The cattle went into the pens. After nearly 3 months of open country, they went in with the audible reluctance of animals being asked to accept confinement after long movement. The herd compressing from the wide formation of the trail into the confined geometry of the stockyard. The cattle pressing against each other and against the wooden fence rails and producing a continuous low protest. The crew worked the cattle into the pens and closed the gates. Then they stood outside the pens and looked at each other. It was over. Not officially, not until the sale was complete and the wages were paid. But the driving was over. And the driving was what the crew had been for nearly 3 months. And without it, they were 12 individuals standing outside a stockyard in Abilene, Kansas, in the middle of a morning, with nothing that needed to be done right now. The transition was abrupt in a way Eli had not anticipated. He had been thinking about the end of the drive for weeks. The way you think about a destination when you are tired, and the destination represents relief. He had imagined the end as an arrival, a threshold crossed, a clear before and after. What he was experiencing instead was something more ambiguous, a state in which the thing he had been doing was no longer happening, but its replacement had not yet begun. Wallace was already disassembling the chuck wagon with the systematic efficiency of a man who had done this at the end of many drives, and who understood that the drive's end was his work beginning. The cleaning and restocking and repair that would prepare the wagon for whatever came next. Denton was in the stockyard office with the cattle buyer, going over the count and the weight and the price. The rest of the crew drifted in different directions. Eli went to June. He unsaddled her and rubbed her down with more care than the quick work of the trail had allowed, going over her with the attention he had not always had time to give during the drive. He found 2 small places on her back where the saddle had created friction over weeks of use. Nothing serious, but something he was glad to find now, rather than to have found too late. He treated them with what Wallace had remaining in the medical supply, and stood back and looked at her. She was thinner than she had been in May. They all were. The trail had a caloric accounting that the food supply only approximately met, and the gap between supply and expenditure had been made up by the body's own reserves over nearly 3 months. And the result was visible in the reduced outline of a horse that had done serious work on trail rations. She was sound, though, all 4 legs clean and tight, eyes clear, wind good. She had carried him through everything the trail had produced, and had not broken down, and had not failed him in any situation that had mattered. He put his hand on her neck. She turned her head toward him, and then away, her attention moving to the stockyard and the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the town, processing the new environment with the alert competence she brought to everything. The sale took most of the afternoon. Denton came out of the stockyard office at 4 o'clock and called the crew together near the chuck wagon. He had a leather pouch. He went through the crew one at a time, reading each name from his record book, counting out the wages owed. No ceremony, no speech. Each man's name, each man's amount, each man's money placed in his hand and received without comment, because the receiving needed no comment. Ellie's name. He stepped forward. Denton counted out the bills and coins with the careful accuracy he brought to all accounting and placed them in Eli's hand. $90. 3 months at $30, minus a few dollars for items drawn against wages during the drive, plus a small additional amount that Denton did not explain and that Eli did not ask about. He stood with the money in his hand. He had $50 in the lining of his coat from before the drive. He had $90 from the drive. He had $140. The horse cost 70. He had been doing this arithmetic for 3 months. He had done it so many times that the numbers had become mental furniture, present without requiring effort. But standing outside a stockyard in Abilene, with the actual money in his actual hand, the arithmetic became something other than arithmetic. He stood there for a moment. Then he put the money in his inside coat pocket, next to the 50 that had been there since May, and buttoned it. Abilene that evening was what it had been built to be. The saloons filled before dark. The sound of the town after nearly 3 months of trail sound was specific in its difference. Loud in the frequencies that open country was not loud in, the voices of people in buildings creating a resonance that the plains did not produce. Eli walked the main street in the early evening and felt the town as something physical pressing in after the expansiveness of what they had come through. The businesses on the main street of Abilene in 1872 existed for a specific purpose, and that purpose was to move money from the pockets of cowhands who had earned it over 3 months into the pockets of people who had positioned themselves to receive it in an evening. This was not a judgment. It was a structure, visible once you understood what you were looking at. The saloons and the card tables and everything else calibrated to the specific vulnerability of men who had been without spending opportunities for 3 months and who now had wages and a few days and no particular reason to be careful. Eli walked into a saloon. He was not turned away. Kansas was a free state, and the legal situation was what it was. And the saloon owner was a practical businessman who understood that Texas drives included men of various backgrounds, and that being selective about their money made poor business sense. He was served. What surrounded the serving was a more complicated question. The ambient social temperature of the room, the way space arranged itself around him, and the conversations near him adjusted in small ways. He had learned to read these adjustments over many years with the accuracy of someone whose circumstances required that skill. He drank 1 beer. It cost more than he expected. He had not been in a position to form expectations about the price of beer for 3 months. And the price in Abilene reflected the market for a commodity that cowhands wanted urgently after a long drive, and were willing to pay for accordingly. He drank it slowly and looked at the room. Then he left. He found Wallace at the chuck wagon, working through the end-of-drive inventory with a thoroughness that Wallace brought to all inventories. Eli sat on the ground nearby and watched Wallace work for a while. "How much did you spend?" Wallace said without looking up. 40 cents. Eli said. Wallace made a sound. "Some of the crew will be broke before morning," he said. "I know," Eli said. "That is also a choice." Wallace said. "Not the choice I would make, but a choice." He made a notation. "You have what you need," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Eli said. Wallace nodded and kept working. Eli sat with him as the town made its noise around them, and the stars came out above Abilene in the same profusion they had come out above every point on the trail. Not diminished by the distance traveled, not different in any way that mattered. "Wallace," he said. Wallace looked up. "Thank you," Eli said. Wallace looked at him for a moment longer than was usual for him. "For what?" he said. "You know for what," Eli said. Wallace held his gaze for a moment. Then he went back to his inventory. "Get some sleep," he said. "The ride back is its own thing." Eli went to his bedroll. He lay on his back and looked at the sky above Abilene. He was going to leave in the morning. He was going to ride south through Kansas and through the territory and back into Texas, through the same country he had come through going north, except without the cattle and without the crew and without Denton's record book, keeping track of every variable between here and home. He was going to ride to a ranch south of San Antonio and put $140 minus $70 of it on a table in front of a man who had set a price and a deadline. And the man was going to give him a signed paper. And the paper was going to mean that the bay horse that had been his father's horse for 12 years was going to be his. Not the 12 years. Those were gone and could not be purchased. But the horse. In the stockyard nearby. 2,500 cattle that had walked 1,000 miles from Texas stood in their pens and waited for whatever came next. Indifferent to the town around them. Indifferent to the accounting done in their name. Indifferent to the fact that their arrival here on this evening was the point toward which nearly 3 months of human effort had been directed. They were cattle. They had walked north because people had kept them walking north. The people had walked north for reasons of their own. Eli closed his eyes. He slept. The crew dissolved over 3 days. It did not happen all at once. The way the drive had begun, all at once, on a Monday morning in May, with 12 men assembling at the same place, at the same time, for the same purpose. It happened the way things assembled for a specific purpose come apart when the purpose is complete. Each piece returning to wherever it had come from, or going somewhere new. The group that had existed for nearly 3 months, becoming, over the course of 3 days in Abilene, a collection of individuals again. The Hill Country brothers left first, riding south together on the second morning with the energy of young men who had done something difficult and survived it and were now in a hurry to be somewhere. They could talk about it. They said more words in their farewell than they had used combined in the previous 6 weeks, which was its own kind of information about what the long middle had cost them and what Abilene had given back. Reed left quietly, the way he had done everything on the drive, saddling his horse in the early morning of the second day and riding west without announcement. Eli saw him go from across the camp and raised a hand, and Reed raised a hand back, and that was the entirety of the farewell between them. Peters left with Ambrose. This did not surprise Eli when he thought about it, because the two men had been working near each other for nearly 3 months in the low-key mutual awareness of people who understood each other's competence and had no need to discuss it. And that kind of understanding sometimes produced a companionship that had no name but was real. Dawson stayed in Abilene. Eli did not know why and did not ask. Dawson had found something there. Some work, or some person, or some reason that was his own and did not require explanation to the men he had driven cattle with for 3 months. Denton settled the final accounting on the 3rd morning, clearing any remaining questions about wages and expenses. Then he said to the remaining crew that it had been a good drive and that he would hire back the ones who wanted to come back. And that was the sum of his sentiment about nearly 3 months of work that had asked everything of everyone present. Eli thought that was correct. It had been a good drive. The cattle had arrived in Abilene in reasonable condition. The accounting had come out in the acceptable range. No one had died. Those were the metrics, and they had been met. Casimiro left on the 3rd afternoon. He had been ready to leave since the first morning in Abilene. Eli thought, in the sense that Casimiro had no relationship to the town and had been waiting for the formal processes of the drive's end to complete themselves so that he could go. He packed his gear with the same economy of motion that characterized everything he did, and saddled his horse and rode to where Eli was standing near the chuck wagon. He stopped his horse and looked at Eli for a moment. The evening before, Eli had watched Casimiro do something he had not seen him do in nearly 3 months of working alongside him. He had been sitting alone near the remnants of the last chuck wagon fire, not working, not assessing anything, just sitting with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes somewhere past the edge of the firelight. And there was something in his stillness that was different from the working stillness Eli had learned to read over the course of the drive. It was the stillness of a man who was not here, who had traveled in his mind to some other place or some other time, and who was allowing himself to do this for a few minutes because the work was done and the doing of it was no longer the only available option. Eli had not disturbed him. He had watched from a distance and thought about what it cost to carry what Casimiro carried. The knowledge that half of what he knew had been taken from people like him and was now being called by different names and attributed to different sources, and the decision he had made somewhere along the way to keep doing the work anyway, to keep being useful in a world that had decided not to remember where the usefulness came from. He did not know if this was what Casimiro was thinking about by the fire. He was almost certain it was part of it. Now Casimiro looked at him from his horse and said, in the careful English he used when he wanted precision, "You listened." He said it the way he said most things, as observation rather than compliment, a statement of fact about what had happened rather than praise for it. Eli said, "I tried to." Casimiro nodded once. Then he rode west and south, toward whatever country he was going back to, and Eli watched him until the distance made him indistinguishable from the landscape he was riding through. Wallace was the last. He needed an extra day to finish the chuck wagon inventory and make the repairs the drive had deferred to its end. The wheel that needed attention, and the canvas that needed patching, and the chuck box hinge that had been managed with a workaround since the territory. Eli stayed with him because there was no reason not to, and because leaving before Wallace was finished felt wrong in a way he did not try to articulate. They worked in the companionable silence of two people who did not need to fill the time between them with words. Near the end of the evening, Wallace said, "What will you do when you get back?" "Go to the ranch," Eli said. "Buy the horse. Then figure out the rest." Wallace tightened the chuck box hinge with the deliberate care of someone making a repair meant to last. "Your father would have done this drive," he said. "Not a question. He would have done it better," Eli said. "Maybe," Wallace said, "or maybe just differently. A man does a thing the way his life has equipped him to do it. Your life equipped you well enough." He tested the hinge. It held. "The horse will be good," he said. "Whatever comes after will figure itself out." Eli left Abilene on the 4th morning. The ride south was different from everything that had preceded it. The country was the same country. The Kansas grass, and then the territory, and then the Red River, and then Texas. June moved under him with the same competent attention she had shown for 3 months. The weather was the late summer weather of the southern plains, hot and clear. But he was alone. After 3 months of never being more than a quarter-mile from the work of the drive and the people doing it, the solitude of the ride south had a texture that was almost physical. He could hear his own thinking in a way that had not been available since May. He could stop when he wanted to stop, and ride at whatever pace suited him, and eat when he was hungry rather than when the schedule required. This was the freedom the legend promised. He had imagined it often in the months before the drive. The idea of being out on the open range, answerable to no one, moving through the country under his own direction. That image had carried a weight of appeal that he now understood had been built on not knowing what the alternative felt like. The freedom was real. It also felt, in the first days of the ride south, like a different kind of difficulty than the one he had left behind. The difficulty of the drive had been the difficulty of too much, too many demands at once, too many variables requiring simultaneous attention. The difficulty of the solitary ride was the difficulty of not enough. The sudden absence of the structure that had organized every hour for 3 months, leaving him in a present that had no immediate requirements, and therefore no shape. He adjusted. By the third day, he had found the rhythm of the solitary ride. The pace that covered ground without exhausting June, the stopping points that made sense, the economy of the solo camp. He cooked for himself with the limited capability of someone who had been cooked for by a professional for 3 months. The food was adequate. He had eaten things that were adequate for long enough that adequate had lost its negative connotation. He crossed back into Texas on a Tuesday. He stopped June at the river's edge and looked at the water, which was lower now than it had been in late June. The summer heat having drawn it down from the level that had made the crossing a serious business 2 months before. He could see the sandbar clearly from the bank. The crossing point that Denton had selected was obvious, the place where the river made it easiest to get from one side to the other. He crossed without incident. On the ride south, through Texas, he thought about the drive the way you think about something recently completed, with the particular clarity that distance provides. The events and the people visible from outside, now in a way they had not been visible from within. He could see the shape of it, the beginning and the end and the long middle, in a way that had not been available when he was in it. He had learned the things he expected to learn, the practical knowledge of the trail, water and grass and cattle and horses, and the specific skills required to keep a herd moving north. He had learned them the way you learn things that matter, by doing them wrong and then doing them less wrong and eventually doing them right, with the evidence of each correction visible in the results. He had learned things he had not expected to learn. From Denton, he had learned that authority, which knows what it is doing, does not need to explain itself constantly. That the most important decisions often look like nothing from the outside, because the decision-maker has positioned things so that the problem resolves before it becomes visible. From Wallace, he had learned that the work of keeping people fed and rested and in sufficient spirits to continue was as demanding as any other work on the drive, and was often invisible for the same reason that Denton's best decisions were invisible, because it succeeded before the failure it prevented became apparent. From Casimiro, he had learned that the knowledge which lives in the body, in the hands and the ears and the way a rider's seat communicates with the horse beneath him, was a different kind of knowledge from the kind that lives in the mind, and that the second kind was nearly useless without the first. From the drive itself, he had learned that endurance was not a feeling, but a practice, a set of decisions made over and over in conditions that argued against them, and that the practice of it was available to him in ways he had not known before he was required to practice it. He reached Bexar County on a Friday afternoon in September. The ranch was where it had always been. The bay horse was in the near pasture, moving with the particular carriage of an animal that had been ridden well for many years. The posture that good riding over time produces, and that did not go away even when the riding stopped. He had been watching this horse from a distance for 2 years. He rode to the main house and found the owner and placed the money on the table, the amount they had agreed to. The owner counted it and wrote the paper and gave it to him, and Eli folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He led the bay horse out of the pasture. The horse stood with him in the September evening light and looked at him with the calm, dark eyes of an animal that had known people for a long time and had developed a measured relationship with them based on accumulated experience. Eli put his hand on the horse's neck. The horse did not move away. He stood there for a while and did not try to make the moment into something larger than it was. He had ridden 1,000 miles and back to be standing here. He was standing here. The horse was here. He thought about his father. He thought about Thomas Colm riding this horse for 12 years. Knowing this horse the way you know things, you have worked with long enough that the working goes below the level of thought. He thought about what his father would have known about this animal that Eli was never going to know. The 12 years of small daily adjustments and accumulated understanding that could not be purchased or inherited or recovered. Some things could not be bought back. The horse was here, though. He named it Thomas, not as a monument or a formal tribute, because that was what felt right when he had stood with the animal long enough to know what name fitted. The next morning he began the work of learning the horse, the same patient accumulation of small observations that he had done with June, paying attention to what the animal showed him and adjusting to it rather than imposing what he expected. The horse was older than June and had more history in its body. Habits formed over years of being ridden by one man in one particular way, and those habits were information about his father that could be read if you paid close enough attention. He paid close attention. Some of what he found in the horse's habits he recognized from watching his father work. The preference for a slightly wider turning arc on the left side, the way the horse settled when the rider's weight shifted back rather than forward. Small things, specific things. The residue of 12 years of a man on a horse's back who had his own particular way of riding. He rode Thomas every day. He did not know yet what came next after the horse, what the rest of his life was going to look like, what work would be available to him, or what he would make of what was available. He had some money left from the drive after paying for the horse. Not much, but some. Enough for a small margin. For now, that was enough. The bay horse was his. The work of knowing it was underway. The morning was cool in the way of September mornings in South Texas. The heat that had defined every day of the drive, already beginning to release its grip on the season. He put his boots on. They were dry. The cattle drives lasted approximately 20 years, from the late 1860s. when the first large drives began pushing Texas cattle north to the Kansas railheads in numbers that made the economics work, to the middle 1880s, when a combination of forces closed the open range era with a finality that left almost nothing of it standing. 20 years was not a long time in the life of a nation. It was shorter than most American institutions that people consider permanent. It was shorter than many individual careers. It was long enough to become a legend. The forces that ended the drives arrived from several directions at once. Railroads extended south and west into Texas through the 1870s and 1880s. And as the lines reached closer to the cattle country, the distance a herd needed to walk to reach a shipping point shrank, and as the distance shrank, the economics of the long trail drive began to unravel. A rancher who could move his cattle to a nearby Texas railhead did not need to hire 12 men and a cook and a wrangler and outfit a chuck wagon and spend 3 months walking animals north through river crossings and thunderstorms and Indian territory. The calculation that had made the long drives necessary stopped working when the railroad shortened the distance enough. Barbed wire changed the open range. The practical barbed wire fence, commercially available from the mid-1870s onward, moved across the Plains states with a speed that the open range era had not anticipated. Farmers fenced their field. Ranchers fenced their grazing land. The corridors the trails had followed, which had been legally ambiguous or simply ignored in the years when the drives were moving through country that had not yet been fully settled, became contested and then closed as the settlement filled in around them. Texas tick fever closed the Kansas markets. Texas longhorns carried a tick that transmitted a disease deadly to other cattle without making the longhorns themselves visibly ill. Kansas cattlemen, watching their herds sicken and die after Texas drives passed through, applied political pressure, and quarantine laws followed, pushing the drives first to different railheads and then making the economics of the long drive increasingly difficult to justify. By the middle 1880s, the classic long drive era was effectively over. The last drives were shorter, closer, moving to nearer railheads. The men who had spent careers on the trail were in their 30s and 40s, and they found other work, or other versions of the same work, in a landscape that was changing faster than most of them had expected it to change. Some adapted, some did not. Some simply found that the world they had learned to operate in had stopped existing, and that the skills it had required did not fully transfer to what replaced it. The legend began before the drives were over. This was the part that mattered, because it meant the legend was not built by people looking back at something finished. It was built by people looking at something still happening and deciding, in real time, what they needed it to mean. The dime novels of the 1870s and 1880s sold to people in eastern cities who had no direct experience of Texas cattle country, and who were reading a story about a version of American life that contained things their own lives did not. Freedom from the constraints of industrial and urban existence, individual competence tested against natural obstacles, a landscape of moral clarity where the good men were distinguishable from the bad and the conflict between them resolved in ways that the conflicts of ordinary American life did not. The cowboy those novels described was not the man who rode drag at the back of a herd in South Texas, eating dust for $30 a month. That man did not translate into the narrative the novels needed. What the narrative needed was the gun. The duel. The lone rider making his own law in open country. The gun was real. Cowboys carried guns and used them for practical purposes. And violence in the cowtowns was real, though it was usually less organized and less honorable than the fiction depicted. But the gun became the center of the legend, in a way that reflected what the legend needed rather than what the work was. The work was repetitive and technical, and conducted in conditions of physical difficulty that the legend found inconvenient. The gun was visible and dramatic and morally simple. Buffalo Bill Cody understood this. His Wild West show, which debuted in 1883 and toured for decades, was not a documentary. It was a performance of what the West meant to an audience that wanted meaning rather than accuracy. The performers were real people, some with genuine experience of the frontier. But what they performed was a version shaped by what the audience was prepared to receive. The audience paid to see freedom. Individual freedom. The man on the horse, answerable to no one, moving through open country under his own law. It was a story about what America wanted to believe it was, and the cowboy was the vessel for that story. And the vessel was useful enough that it has never quite been set down. Eli was not in that show. Not Eli specifically, and not the men like him. The black cowhands who had ridden the same trails and crossed the same rivers and run the same stampedes for the same $30 a month were present in the reality and absent from the myth, which was a pattern with a long history in American life, and which Eli, if he had been watching the show in its touring years, would have recognized without being surprised by it. Casimiro was not in that show either. The vaquero tradition that had built the techniques and the vocabulary of the entire cattle industry appeared in the show's performances as a minor curiosity. The Mexican rope tricks that filled one slot in a program organized around different priorities. The show's priorities were American in a specific sense, the sense of a particular version of American that had been decided upon by the people with the most direct access to the tools of cultural production. The publishers and the showmen, and later the film directors, who found the cowboy story so endlessly useful because it was clean, and because clean was what the story required. The cleanliness had a cost. It cost the true complexity of the men who had actually done the work, the economic reality that had organized the entire enterprise, the chain of ownership and profit that ran from Texas ranchers to Kansas buyers to Chicago meatpackers to Eastern consumers, with the cowhands at the bottom of it throughout. The presence of the people whose land the drives crossed, who had watched their territory and their futures compress in the same decades the drives were occurring. The vaquero tradition the whole industry depended on. The black cowhands, who had been a significant portion of the workforce and whom the myth made nearly invisible. What the cleanliness gave back was a story that could be understood immediately and repeated endlessly. The man on the horse against the sunset, free, individual, defined by his competence and his character, rather than by the economic and social structures that defined nearly everyone else. That man was useful. He did real work for a story that needed him. He was just not particularly accurate. Eli rode 3 drives total. The Abilene drive in 1872, a shorter drive to Ellsworth the following spring, and one more drive the spring after that. Then he stopped. He had enough money after the third drive to rent a small piece of land outside San Antonio and enough knowledge of horses and cattle to make himself useful to the ranches in the area without committing to another 3 months on a trail that was already beginning to change as the railroads pushed south and the mathematics of the long drive started to shift. He kept June for several years until she was too old to work. And then he kept her anyway. Because some relationships outlast their practical justification. He kept Thomas until the horse died in the middle 1880s. The same years that the classic cattle drives were ending. He was in his early 30s by then, with work that suited him and a life that had taken a shape he had not fully anticipated. When he scratched his name into a post outside a feed store in 1872, he did not talk much about the drives. When he did talk about them, he found that what he said did not quite match what people expected him to say. They expected the story the legend told, the freedom and the danger and the wide open country and the gunfights that had not actually happened to him and would not have made good stories even if they had. What he had instead was the specific weight of a full water bucket on a Tuesday morning in Kansas, when the canteen was already empty. The particular sound a herd made in the moment before a stampede began, the way June's ears moved when something changed in the environment before anything else indicated that it had. The quality of a biscuit at 6 in the morning after a night guard shift, which was not good by any objective standard, but was the thing standing between you and the start of a long day, and was therefore the most important biscuit in the world at that specific moment. Wallace's voice in the dark at the chuck wagon, saying something in the minimum number of words required. Casimiro's rope moving before Eli could see what the rope was responding to. Denton's back when he rode north alone to read the country ahead of the drive. The particular set of his shoulders when he was calculating something he had not yet decided to share. These were the things Eli had. They were not the things that went on the posters. Somewhere in the grass of Kansas and Indian Territory, the trail still ran in the years after the drives ended. You could see it from certain angles, in certain light, a depression where the grass grew differently, the lasting record of what had passed over that ground, often enough and heavily enough that the earth itself had registered it. 2,500 cattle times 100 drives times 20 years left a mark that grass could grow back over but could not entirely erase. The ground knew what had happened on it. The men who had done the work knew what they had done. The poster said something else. And the poster was what most people saw, and what most people remembered, and what most people, when they thought of the American cowboy, thought of first and last. But the ground was there before the poster. The ground would be there after. And in that ground, pressed into the soil by 10,000 hooves, and the boots of 12 men walking alongside them through 3 months of a Kansas summer, was the actual record of the thing. Patient and specific and available to anyone who wanted to get close enough to read it. Most people did not get that close. The poster was easier. The poster was clean and clear and did not ask you to think about the economics of the beef supply chain, or the land rights of the Cherokee Nation, or the $30 a month, or the wet boots at 4 in the morning, or the man riding drag in a wall of dust who was going to be someone's legend someday, and did not know it yet, and would not have recognized himself in the legend when it came. He just knew he needed $70 and had a way to get it, and was willing to do the work. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. It was everything.